She stepped off that train expecting a new life. What she got was public humiliation and abandonment in a town that didn't want her. Lydia Caldwell came west as a mail-order bride with nothing but hope and a worn suitcase. The man who sent for her took one look and walked away, leaving her stranded 2,000 miles from home with nowhere to go. But what happened next changed everything, because one man had been watching, one man saw what she truly was, and one man would love her long before she ever knew his name. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The train's whistle cut through the Colorado afternoon like a knife through silk, sharp and final. Lydia Caldwell pressed her gloved hand against the smudged window, watching the stark landscape roll past. Endless brown hills dotted with scrub brush, mountains rising like broken teeth against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Everything here was different from Boston. Harder. Rawer. More honest, perhaps, in its refusal to pretend beauty where there was only survival. She'd been traveling for 6 days. 6 days of rattling track and strangers' stares, of stale bread and water that tasted of metal, of sleeping upright with her carpet bag clutched to her chest because trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. 6 days to think about what she was doing, to question every decision that had led her to answer an advertisement in the Boston Evening Transcript from a man named Gerald Pruitt who needed a wife and promised security, respect, and a home in the West. Seeking respectable woman of good character for marriage. Widower, property owner, established business in growing Colorado territory. Reply with reference and photograph. Lydia had replied with her father's minister as reference, and the only photograph she owned, 3 years old now, taken before illness had hollowed her father's face and drained their savings account into doctors' pockets and medicine bottles. Before the consumption had taken him on a February morning while snow fell silently outside their rented room. Before the landlord had given her 1 week to settle accounts or vacate. She touched the mourning brooch at her collar, the only piece of her mother's jewelry she'd kept. Everything else had been sold. The house, her childhood home with its garden and familiar creaking stairs, had been lost 2 years ago when her father's law practice failed. They'd been living in boarding houses since then, growing poorer by the month, her father growing sicker, until finally there was nothing left but debts and a daughter with no prospects. So Lydia had become a commodity, packaging herself in careful handwriting and modest promises, sending her future west in an envelope while she'd stayed behind to bury her father in a pauper's grave because there was no money even for that final dignity. The train began to slow. Her stomach tightened, a fist of anxiety beneath her ribs. She smoothed her traveling dress, dark blue wool, respectable but worn, and checked her reflection in the window. 24 years old, dark hair pulled back in a simple style, gray eyes that had seen too much loss too quickly. She looked tired. She looked poor. She looked exactly like what she was, a desperate woman with no other choices. He chose you, she reminded herself. From your letter, from your photograph, he chose you. He wants you here. But her hand still trembled as she reached for her carpet bag. The town of Ridgewood materialized outside the window like something from a fever dream, a single rutted street lined with wooden buildings that looked temporary, as if they might blow away in a strong wind. A general store, a saloon with bat-wing doors, what might have been a hotel, and a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left. Beyond it all, the mountains rose in massive indifference, beautiful and terrible. This would be her home now. This collection of desperate buildings clinging to the edge of civilization, this place where her letters had traveled, where Gerald Pruitt waited with his promises of security and respect. The train shuddered to a complete stop. Steam hissed. A conductor called out, "Ridgewood! Ridgewood Station!" Lydia stood on shaking legs, pulling her carpet bag from the overhead rack. It contained everything she owned now. 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, her father's watch, a packet of letters tied with ribbon, and 3 silver dollars that represented the absolute sum of her worldly wealth. 24 years of life reduced to what could fit in one worn bag. She made her way down the narrow aisle, past families and cowboys and women who looked at her with the quick assessment she'd grown used to. Another mail-order bride, another desperate female trading everything for the promise of a man's name and protection. The judgment in their eyes didn't sting anymore. Lydia had learned to carry shame like a coat, uncomfortable but necessary. The conductor helped her down the steep steps onto the platform. The afternoon sun hit her full in the face, hot and immediate after the train's dimness. The air smelled of dust and livestock, and something sharp she couldn't identify. The platform was crowded with people. Men in work clothes, women in bonnets, children darting between adult legs like territorial animals. And somewhere in this crowd was Gerald Pruitt. She'd memorized his single letter, the one he'd sent after receiving her response, confirming the arrangement. I will meet your train on September 14th. I am 43 years of age, 5 feet 11 inches, dark hair graying at temples. I will be wearing a black suit. We will marry immediately, as I cannot have unmarried woman residing in my home. The minister has been notified. No flowery words, no false promises of affection, just facts, blunt and honest. Lydia had appreciated that, actually. She wasn't coming west for romance. She was coming for survival, and Gerald Pruitt's directness suggested he understood the transaction as clearly as she did. She scanned the crowd, looking for a man in a black suit. There, near the station house. Tall, dark-haired, wearing black. Her heart hammered. This was it. This was the moment her new life began. She picked up her carpet bag and started walking toward him, trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. The platform boards creaked under her worn boots. People jostled past her, too busy with their own concerns to notice another anonymous woman in an anonymous crowd. She was 10 feet away when he turned. Not toward her. Toward a blonde woman in an expensive traveling suit who was descending from the first-class car with a matched set of leather luggage. The man in black's face transformed, a smile breaking across features that had been stern in repose. He moved toward the blonde woman with eager purpose. Lydia stopped walking, confused. That wasn't, but he matched the description exactly. Black suit, dark hair, the right age. Unless, Miss Caldwell? The voice came from her left. She turned to find a boy of perhaps 15, red-haired and freckled, holding a piece of paper. Yes, she said. I'm Lydia Caldwell. Mr. Pruitt sent me to fetch you. The boy's eyes skated away from hers, a tell she recognized instantly. Whatever was coming next, he didn't want to deliver it. He asked me to bring you to his shop. Not asked me to bring you to the minister. Not asked me to bring you to his home. His shop. The anxiety in her stomach turned to something colder. Of course, she said, keeping her voice level. Lead the way. The boy hefted her carpet bag, lighter than he expected, clearly, and started walking. Lydia followed, her mind racing. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Gerald Pruitt was supposed to meet her personally, was supposed to greet his future wife with at least the pretense of welcome. Sending a boy suggested, what? Last-minute business? Cold feet? Something worse? They walked down the main street, dust rising around their feet. Lydia was aware of curious stares, of conversations pausing as she passed. In a town this small, strangers were noticed. Stranger women arriving alone were noticed more. The boy stopped in front of a narrow building with a painted sign, Pruitt's Dry Goods. Through the window, Lydia could see shelves of fabric, bins of supplies, the ordinary commerce of frontier life. And behind the counter, a man in shirt sleeves and a vest. Gerald Pruitt. She knew him immediately, even though she'd never seen him before. Something about the set of his shoulders, the particular way he moved, she simply knew. The boy pushed open the door, bell jangling overhead. Sir, Miss Caldwell is here. The man behind the counter looked up. He was handsome in a severe way, sharp features, neatly trimmed mustache, calculating eyes that assessed Lydia in one sweeping glance and clearly found her wanting. She watched his expression shift from neutral to disappointed in the space of a heartbeat. Her stomach dropped. Miss Caldwell, he said. Not a greeting. A statement. A confirmation of something he'd already decided. You're younger than your photograph suggested. It was an obvious lie. She looked exactly like her photograph, perhaps thinner, perhaps more tired, but recognizably the same woman. What he meant was, you're not what I wanted. What he meant was, I've changed my mind. The photograph was taken 3 years ago, Lydia said carefully, but I don't believe I've changed significantly. No. He set down the ledger he'd been writing in. No, I suppose you haven't. The silence stretched out. The boy shifted uncomfortably by the door. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. Lydia's hands tightened on her reticule, knuckles going white. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. "The minister?" "Yes, about that." He came around the counter with the air of a man delivering an unpleasant but necessary verdict. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Miss Caldwell. Upon further reflection, I've realized this arrangement isn't suitable." The words hit her like physical blows. Not suitable. The arrangement, not her specifically, but the transaction itself, as if he could simply unmake a promise the way you'd return defective merchandise. "I don't understand," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. "We corresponded. You agreed. I've changed my mind. Flat. Final. I'm within my rights. No contract has been signed, no vows exchanged. I'm sorry you traveled so far, but I cannot in good conscience proceed with a marriage I've come to recognize as a mistake." Lydia felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She'd sold everything, traveled 6 days, committed herself completely to this arrangement. She had $3 silver and no return ticket. She had no family, no home, no prospects. She had nothing except Gerald Pruitt's written promise, and he was taking it back. "You wrote to me," she said, and now her voice shook with barely controlled anger. "You asked me to come here. I gave up everything based on your word. And I apologize for that." He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded annoyed, as if she were being difficult about something perfectly reasonable. "But surely you can see it's better to end this now than to trap us both in an unsuitable marriage. I'll pay for a room at the boarding house for 3 nights. That should give you time to make arrangements." "Arrangements?" The word came out sharp. "What arrangements? I have no money for a return ticket. I have nowhere to go." "That's not my responsibility." His voice hardened. "You're a grown woman, Miss Caldwell. I'm sure you'll figure something out. Perhaps there's employment in town, or you could appeal to the church for charity. But I will not be coerced into marriage by your financial difficulties." Coerced. As if she were threatening him, manipulating him, rather than simply asking him to honor his commitment. Lydia felt rage building behind her breastbone, hot and clean and useless. "I'm not trying to coerce you," she said tightly. "I'm trying to understand how a man of business, a man who presumably values his reputation, can break his word so casually." His face flushed. "Watch your tone, Miss Caldwell. I've offered you 3 nights room and board out of Christian charity. Don't test my generosity." "Charity?" The word tasted like ash. "You invite a woman to travel 2,000 miles on your promise, then abandon her and call it charity when you throw her a few coins." "Tommy," Gerald Pruitt said to the boy, not looking away from Lydia, "please escort Miss Caldwell to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and arrange her room. 3 nights, meals included. Put it on my account." "Yes, sir," the boy mumbled, clearly desperate to escape. Lydia wanted to refuse, wanted to throw his charity back in his face, wanted to maintain some dignity in this humiliating collapse of her future. But she had $3 silver and nowhere to sleep and no way home. Pride was a luxury for people with choices. 3 nights, she said. "And then what, Mr. Pruitt? What do you imagine happens to me then?" He met her eyes, and what she saw there was worse than cruelty. It was indifference. He'd already moved on from her, already relegated her to the category of unpleasant business concluded. She was a problem solved, a mistake corrected. Nothing more. "That," he said, "is no longer my concern." The dismissal was absolute. Lydia turned and walked out of the shop, back straight, head high, letting the anger carry her because if she let it go, she would collapse right there in the street. Tommy followed with her carpet bag, not speaking. The bell jangled as the door closed behind them. The afternoon sun felt cruel now, exposing her humiliation to the entire town. How many people had watched her walk to Pruitt's shop? How many had guessed what was happening? In a place this small, gossip spread like wildfire. By sunset, everyone in Ridgewood would know. The mail-order bride had been rejected. Tommy led her to a narrow 2-story building with a hand-painted sign. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, clean rooms, respectable clientele. A woman in her 50s stood on the porch, sweeping dust that would return within the hour. She looked up as they approached, her eyes sharpening with interest. "Mrs. Henderson," Tommy said. "Mr. Pruitt's arranged a room for Miss Caldwell. 3 nights, meals included." The woman's eyes widened fractionally. She understood immediately, Lydia could tell. Understood what had happened and what it meant. "I see," Mrs. Henderson said. Her voice was neutral, carefully so. "Well then, come inside, Miss Caldwell. I'll get you settled." Lydia followed her into a dim hallway that smelled of lye soap and boiled vegetables. Mrs. Henderson's running commentary about the house rules, about mealtimes, about the other boarders, washed over her without meaning. She was aware only of the hollow feeling expanding in her chest, the certainty that her life had just careened completely off its rails. The room was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out onto the alley. Clean but spare, temporary housing for temporary people passing through to somewhere better. Except Lydia wasn't passing through. She was stranded. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Henderson said. "Breakfast at 7. We don't accommodate late sleepers or particular eaters." "Thank you," Lydia said automatically. Mrs. Henderson paused at the door, something almost like sympathy crossing her weathered face. "You're not the first girl who's come west to disappointment," she said. "Won't be the last either. Town's not as cruel as you might think if you keep your head up." Then she was gone, closing the door with a soft click. Lydia set her carpet bag on the bed and sank down beside it. Her hands were shaking now, her breath coming short. 3 nights. 3 nights to figure out what to do with a life that had just disintegrated for the second time in 6 months. She could try to find work, but what work? She could cook and clean and sew, skills every woman here already possessed. She could read and write and keep accounts, but those weren't talents this rough town valued in women. She could appeal to the church, but charity only stretched so far. Or she could use her $3 silver to survive as long as possible, stretching meals until the money ran out, until Mrs. Henderson asked her to leave, until she was sleeping in alleys or worse, selling the only thing she had left to sell. The thought made her gorge rise. She'd rather die. Actually, she might. Women alone in these frontier towns, women without protection or resources, they didn't last long. The West swallowed them up, ground them down, buried them in unmarked graves while people clucked their tongues and said, "What a shame, what a waste." Lydia pressed her palms against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. Crying was surrender. Crying meant accepting this nightmare as reality. She needed to think, to plan, to find some way forward that didn't end with her destruction. A knock at the door made her jump. "Yes?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Miss Caldwell?" A man's voice, deep and unfamiliar. "Mrs. Henderson said you'd just arrived. I'm Rowan Blackwood. I'd like a word if you're willing." Lydia stood, smoothing her dress, trying to compose herself. Another stranger, another unknown variable in an equation that kept getting more complicated. She opened the door. The man in the hallway was tall, taller than Gerald Pruitt, broad-shouldered and solid in the way of men who worked with their hands, dark hair, strong features, eyes the color of whiskey in sunlight. He held his hat in his hands and stood with the particular stillness of someone who didn't waste motion. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Ma'am?" He nodded, respectful but direct. "I won't take much of your time. I heard what happened at Pruitt's shop. Whole town knows by now, I expect. I run a cattle ranch about 5 miles out. I'm in need of a housekeeper. Room, board, and $20 a month. Interested?" Lydia stared at him. She'd been in Ridgewood less than an hour, had been rejected and abandoned barely 20 minutes ago, and now a strange man was offering her employment? It felt like a trap. It felt like the kind of offer men made to desperate women when they wanted something other than housekeeping. Her suspicion must have shown on her face because Blackwood's expression didn't change, but something shuddered in his eyes. "It's legitimate work," he said. "I've got a foreman and 3 ranch hands who bunk in the barn, plus a cook who handles their meals. I need someone to manage the main house. Cleaning, laundry, mending, cooking for me when the cook's busy. That's all. No expectations beyond honest work for honest pay." "Why me?" Lydia asked bluntly. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "But I saw you walk out of Pruitt's shop with your head up and your back straight after he humiliated you. That tells me something about your character. And frankly, Miss Caldwell, I need help and you need work. Seems like a reasonable exchange. He made it sound simple. Perhaps it was simple, and she'd just been through so many disasters that she couldn't recognize legitimate opportunity anymore. What if I steal from you? She asked. What if I'm lazy or incompetent? Are you? No? Then we'll get along fine. He held her gaze steadily. I'm a blunt man, Miss Caldwell. I don't make promises I can't keep, and I don't expect things that weren't agreed upon. You'd have your own room with a lock on the door. You'd work 6 days a week with Sundays free. After 3 months, we evaluate whether the arrangement suits both of us, and either party can end it with a week's notice. That's the offer. 3 months. A reprieve. Time to save money, to figure out her next move, to survive long enough to make actual choices instead of desperate grabs at whatever prevented immediate destruction. When would I start? She asked. Now, if you're willing, I'll have someone bring your things. Lydia thought of Gerald Pruitt's cold dismissal, thought of the $3 that represented her entire fortune, thought of the alternatives if she said no. Slow starvation, charity that would dry up, selling herself in pieces until there was nothing left to sell. And she thought of Rowan Blackwood's steady gaze, the straightforward honesty of his offer, the respect in his voice when he called her Miss Caldwell, instead of treating her like damaged goods. It might be a trap, but it might also be salvation. I accept, she said. He nodded once, as if this was the conclusion he'd expected. Good. I'll settle your bill with Mrs. Henderson and have the wagon brought around. Mr. Blackwood, she said as he turned to go. Why are you doing this? He paused, considering the question. Because Pruitt was wrong to break his word, and because you shouldn't have to pay for his failure of character, and because... He met her eyes again, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I need the help, that's all. But Lydia didn't think that was all, not entirely. There was something else in his eyes, something he wasn't saying, not threat, not the predatory calculation she'd feared. Something different, something she couldn't quite identify. He left, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs. Lydia turned back to her room, her tiny room she'd occupied for less than 20 minutes, and began gathering her few possessions. Her hands were still shaking, but not with fear anymore, with something else, with the strange, fragile beginning of hope. She didn't know Rowan Blackwood, didn't know his ranch or his character or whether his promises meant anything, but she knew Gerald Pruitt had looked at her and seen a mistake to be corrected, and Rowan Blackwood had looked at her and seen someone worth hiring. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd had 10 minutes ago. The wagon was waiting when she came downstairs, a sturdy farm wagon with 2 horses, driven by a Mexican man who introduced himself as Miguel. Rowan Blackwood helped her up to the seat, his hand firm and impersonal under her elbow, and then climbed up beside her. Miguel's my foreman, he said as they started moving. Best horseman in 3 counties and keeps the ranch hands in line. His wife Rosa is the cook I mentioned. You'll like her. Lydia nodded, not trusting her voice. They rolled down Ridgewood's single street, past the church and the saloon, and Gerald Pruitt's shop where her future had died an hour ago. People turned to stare. Of course they did. The rejected mail-order bride leaving town with Rowan Blackwood. The gossip would burn through Ridgewood like a brush fire. Let them talk. Lydia was done caring what strangers thought. The road wound out of town and into open country, the mountains growing larger with each mile. The landscape was harsh but beautiful, scrub grass turning gold in the autumn light, distant peaks crowned with snow, sky so vast it made her feel tiny and infinite at the same time. Boston had been all narrow streets and crowded buildings, the world pressed small and contained. Here, everything was enormous, overwhelming, terrifying in its scale. Takes some getting used to, Rowan Blackwood said, following her gaze. The size of it all. Yes, she agreed softly. You miss Boston? No. The answer surprised her with its certainty. There's nothing there for me now, nothing anywhere really, except what I make. He glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. That's the truth of it, isn't it? Out here, you're what you make yourself. What you've been doesn't matter as much as what you do. Is that why you came west? She asked. To remake yourself? Something like that. His tone suggested the subject was closed. They drove in silence for a while. Lydia watched the landscape roll past, trying to absorb the reality of her situation. This morning she'd been on a train, traveling toward a planned future as Gerald Pruitt's wife. Now she was in a wagon beside a stranger, heading toward an unknown ranch to work as a housekeeper. Her life had pivoted completely in the space of 2 hours. The ranch appeared gradually, first fence lines, then cattle grazing on hillsides, then buildings coming into focus. A large barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses, and at the center of it all, a house. 2 stories, solid timber construction, with a wide porch and actual glass windows that caught the afternoon sun. It was bigger than she'd expected, more substantial, established, not the desperate homestead she'd imagined. "The house needs work," Rowan said, and she heard something defensive in his tone. "It's been bachelor quarters for 5 years. I know it's rough." "It's beautiful," Lydia said honestly. Compared to the boarding houses and cramped rooms she'd been living in, it looked like a mansion. He pulled the wagon up to the front porch. A woman emerged from the house, plump, dark-haired, wearing an apron and a warm smile. Rosa, presumably. "Ay, Dios mío," Rosa said, her hands going to her hips as she looked at Rowan. "You actually found someone, and so quickly?" "Rosa, this is Miss Caldwell. She'll be keeping house. Miss Caldwell, Rosa handles the ranch hand's meals and will help you learn the property." "Bienvenida, Miss Caldwell," Rosa said, coming forward with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the Blackwood Ranch. Come, you must be exhausted from traveling. I'll show you the house." Lydia climbed down from the wagon, legs stiff from the ride. Rosa swept her inside with a stream of Spanish-accented English, pointing out rooms and explaining routines while Rowan carried her carpetbag upstairs. The house was indeed rough, as he'd warned, dusty and cluttered with the particular neglect of men who viewed domestic space as purely functional. But it had good bones, solid floors, a large kitchen with a proper stove, spacious rooms with high ceilings, that porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It could be beautiful with care and attention. "Your room," Rosa announced, pushing open a door on the 2nd floor. It was easily 3 times the size of the room at Mrs. Henderson's. A real bed with an iron frame, a proper wardrobe, a window with curtains, faded and dusty, but curtains nonetheless. A washstand with a pitcher and basin, and most importantly, a lock on the door. "Mr. Blackwood's room is at the other end of the hall," Rosa said, reading Lydia's thoughts with uncomfortable accuracy. "He respects privacy, see? You need not worry." "I appreciate that," Lydia said carefully. "He is a good man." Rosa's voice was firm. "Hard sometimes, quiet always, but good. He will keep his word to you." Rowan appeared in the doorway with her carpet bag. "I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's at 6:30. We eat in the kitchen, nothing formal. Tomorrow Rosa can show you around properly." He paused. "Miss Caldwell, the arrangement is 3 months' trial, as I said, but I meant the other part too. If at any point you want to leave, you tell me and I'll pay you what you're owed and arrange transportation wherever you need to go. You're not trapped here." "Thank you," Lydia said. He nodded and left, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Rosa lingered a moment, her dark eyes kind. "You've had a terrible day, see? But tomorrow will be better. You'll see." Then she too was gone, and Lydia was alone in her new room, in her new home, temporary home, on a ranch 5 miles from the town where she'd been publicly humiliated just hours ago. She sank onto the bed, testing its firmness. Good quality, comfortable. Everything in the room spoke of money spent carefully but not stingily, of someone who valued function over flash but didn't skimp on necessities. Through the window, she could see the land rolling away toward distant mountains. The sun was lowering toward the peaks, turning everything golden. It was beautiful. It was strange. It was nothing like the future she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that train, but it was hers, at least for now. 3 months to prove herself, to save money, to figure out what came next. 3 months of dignity and honest work instead of charity or worse. Lydia unpacked her carpetbag slowly, hanging her 2 dresses in the wardrobe, setting her mother's Bible on the nightstand, tucking her father's watch carefully in the drawer, placing her few possessions in this space that was now, however temporarily, hers. When she was done, she sat at the window and watched the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. And for the first time since her father died, since her life had collapsed, since she'd answered that advertisement and committed herself to a stranger's promises, Lydia Caldwell felt something other than fear or grief or desperate determination. She felt possibility. It was terrifying. It was fragile. It was real. And tomorrow, she would begin again. Dawn came early to the Blackwood Ranch, announced by a rooster's crow and the sound of men's voices drifting up from the barn. Lydia woke disoriented, her body still expecting the narrow bed at Mrs. Henderson's or the rattling motion of the train. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The second-floor room with its faded curtains, the ranch 5 miles from town, the job she'd accepted from a stranger because the alternative was slow destruction. She dressed quickly in her older work dress, pinned her hair back severely, and made her way downstairs. The house was quiet, though she could hear movement in the kitchen. Rosa, probably, preparing breakfast for the ranch hands. The kitchen was warm and bright, morning sun streaming through the windows. Rosa stood at the stove, flipping pancakes with practiced efficiency while bacon sizzled in another pan. She looked up as Lydia entered, her round face breaking into a smile. "Buenos dias, Miss Caldwell. You're up early. The men don't eat until 6. "I'm used to early mornings," Lydia said. "What can I do to help?" Rosa's smile widened. "A woman who offers to work before being asked? Mr. Blackwood chose well. Here, you can set the table in the bunkhouse. Plates are in that cupboard, utensils in the drawer." Lydia gathered the necessary items and followed Rosa's directions to a long building attached to the barn. Inside was a communal space, bunks along one wall, a large table dominating the center, pegs for coats and gear. It smelled of leather and tobacco and the particular musk of men who worked outdoors. She was setting out the last fork when the ranch hands began filing in, bringing the cold morning air and curious stares. 3 men, all young, all watching her with the wary interest of cowboys encountering a woman in their territory. "Morning, ma'am," the tallest one said, removing his hat. He had sandy hair and a boyish face, despite being probably 25. "I'm Charlie. This here's Ben and Tom." "Lydia Caldwell," she said. "I'm the new housekeeper." "We heard about what happened in town yesterday," Ben said, then flushed bright red. That is, we heard Mr. Blackwood hired you. That's good. House needs a woman's touch." "Ben," Charlie said in a warning tone. "What? I didn't mean nothing bad by it." "It's all right," Lydia said, keeping her voice level, though her stomach tightened. Of course they'd heard. Everyone had heard. The rejected mail-order bride was probably the most interesting thing to happen in Ridgewood in months. "Yes, Mr. Pruitt and I found we didn't suit. Fortunately, Mr. Blackwood had a position available." She delivered this in the same tone she might use to discuss the weather, daring them to make something ugly out of it. Charlie caught her meaning and nodded respectfully. "Well, we're glad to have you, ma'am. House has been pretty grim since—" He stopped abruptly. "Since?" Lydia prompted. An uncomfortable silence fell. The men exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Tom, the youngest, opened his mouth, but Charlie kicked him under the table. "Just been a while since we had proper housekeeping," Charlie finished. "That's all." It wasn't all. That much was obvious. But before Lydia could press further, Rosa arrived with platters of food, and Miguel behind her carrying a massive coffee pot. The foreman nodded to Lydia, his weathered face neutral but not unfriendly. "Miss Caldwell, you settling in all right?" "Yes, thank you." "Good. You need anything, you ask Rosa or you ask me. Mr. Blackwood, he's out checking the north fence line this morning, but he'll be back by noon." The men fell on the food with the single-minded focus of people who did physical labor from sunup to sundown. Lydia and Rosa retreated to the main house kitchen, where a separate, smaller breakfast waited. "They seem nice enough," Lydia said as she poured coffee. "They're good boys," Rosa agreed. "Young, sometimes foolish, but they work hard and they respect Mr. Blackwood. That's what matters on a ranch." "How long have you and Miguel been here?" 3 years. We came after—" Rosa stopped, busied herself with the eggs. "We came when Mr. Blackwood needed help building the ranch up. Before that, we worked on a big hacienda in Texas, but the owner died and his son, he was not a good man. Mr. Blackwood offered us fair wages and respect. We stay. That same conversational dead end. Something had happened here, something that made people stop mid-sentence and changed the subject. Lydia wondered what it was, but she knew better than to push. She'd learn eventually, or she wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't her business unless it affected her safety. So, Rosa said briskly, let me show you the house properly. Mr. Blackwood, he said you should take today to learn everything. Start the real work tomorrow. They spent the morning touring the house room by room. The parlor with its dusty furniture and cold fireplace. The dining room that looked unused, the table covered with papers and ranch ledgers. The study, Rowan's private space, Rosa emphasized, to be cleaned only when he specifically requested it. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms including Lydia's and Rowan's, the others empty and echoing. This was meant to be a family home, Rosa said softly, standing in one of the empty rooms. Big enough for children, for guests. But Mr. Blackwood, he lives here alone. Has he always? Lydia asked. Rosa's eyes shuddered. That's his story to tell, not mine. Come, I'll show you where the cleaning supplies are kept. The hours passed in a blur of information. Where things were stored, how Rowan liked his coffee, which days the laundry needed doing, when supplies got ordered from town. The house was larger and more complex than anywhere Lydia had worked before. But the principles were the same. Keep things clean, keep things organized, anticipate needs before they became problems. By noon, her head was spinning with details, but she felt more confident. This was work she knew how to do. This was territory where her competence meant something. Rosa was explaining the root cellar when they heard a horse approaching. Through the kitchen window, Lydia saw Rowan dismount near the barn, moving with the easy grace of someone who'd been riding since childhood. He wore work clothes, canvas pants, a worn shirt, a vest, and looked nothing like the formal rancher who'd offered her employment yesterday. He looked like what he was, a man who worked his own land. He'll want lunch, Rosa said. Nothing fancy. Bread, cheese, cold meat, and coffee, always coffee. I can manage that, Lydia said. Rosa gave her an approving nod and headed back to the bunkhouse to feed the hands. Lydia assembled a simple meal, her movements automatic while her mind raced. This was her first time alone with Rowan Blackwood since yesterday's wagon ride. The first test of what their working relationship would actually be. He came in through the kitchen door, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His hair was disheveled, his face windburned, and there was dirt on his clothes. He looked tired. Miss Caldwell, he said. Rosa show you around all right? Yes, sir. I've prepared lunch if you're hungry. Starving, actually. He moved to the sink to wash his hands, and Lydia set the plate on the kitchen table. She'd been about to leave, to give him privacy, when he said, Sit down. Might as well go over the household arrangements while we eat. Lydia hesitated, then took a seat across from him. This was strange, eating with her employer, but then everything about this situation was strange. She'd been here less than a day. She barely knew this man. Yet here they sat, sharing a meal as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Rosa says you're a quick study, Rowan said, biting into the sandwich she'd made. She's pleased. She's been very helpful. The house it's larger than I expected. Built it 5 years ago, had plans for it. His voice went flat on that last sentence, the same careful blankness she'd heard from everyone when they touched on the ranch's past. Anyway, it's more space than I need. Your job is to keep the main living areas clean. Parlor, dining room, kitchen, the upstairs hallway and bedrooms. I clean my own study. The bunkhouse is Rosa's domain. Understood. What about meals? Rosa handles breakfast and supper for the hands. You'll make lunch for me on days I'm working close to the house, and supper for just me on Sundays when Rosa's off. I'm not particular about food. Anything hot and filling works. Laundry? Once a week, Thursdays. There's a woman in town, Mrs. Chen, who takes in washing if you need help with the heavy items. I'll set up an account for household expenses. You'll keep track of what's spent and settle accounts with me monthly. He was methodical, clear, treating this like any business arrangement. Lydia appreciated that. No false intimacy, no blurred lines, just employer and employee establishing the terms of their relationship. Questions? He asked. Just one. Yesterday, you said 3 months trial. Is there anything specific you'll be evaluating? Anything I should focus on? He considered this, chewing thoughtfully. Honestly, I just need someone reliable who does what they say they'll do. Keep the house clean, cook decent food, don't steal or cause drama. That's it. 3 months gives us both time to figure out if the arrangement works without anyone feeling trapped. Fair enough. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Outside, Miguel was working with a young horse in the corral, his patient voice carrying through the window. The kitchen was warm and bright, the coffee strong. For the first time since leaving Boston, Lydia felt something almost like peace. Miss Caldwell, Rowan said suddenly, I want you to understand something. What Pruitt did yesterday was unconscionable. Breaking his word, leaving you stranded, that's not how a man of honor behaves. But I don't want you thinking I hired you out of pity. Lydia looked up sharply. Didn't you? No. His eyes met hers, direct and unflinching. I hired you because I needed help and you needed work. Because you carried yourself with dignity when you had every right to fall apart. Because Rosa and I have been trying to find a housekeeper for 6 months, and everyone we've asked either wants more money than I can pay or won't live this far from town. You were qualified and available. That's not pity, that's practical. I see, Lydia said softly. And I want you to know, whatever happens, whatever you decide after 3 months, you'll leave here with good references and enough money to make a real choice, not another desperate scramble. A choice. That's my word on it. Something tight in Lydia's chest loosened. She hadn't realized how much she'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Rowan to reveal himself as another Gerald Pruitt, a man whose promises meant nothing. But the steadiness in his eyes, the plain honesty of his words, suggested he meant exactly what he said. Thank you, Chess, she said. That means more than you might realize. He nodded once and stood, collecting his plate. I'll be out most afternoons this week. We're moving cattle down from the high pastures before the weather turns. If you need anything, Miguel and Rosa will know where to find me. Then he was gone, back out into the sharp autumn sunshine, leaving Lydia alone in the quiet kitchen with the dishes and her thoughts. The afternoon passed in work, real work, the kind that left her muscles aching and her mind blessedly blank. She started with the parlor, attacking years of accumulated dust and neglect. The furniture was good quality beneath the grime, a sofa and chairs upholstered in dark green fabric, tables made of solid wood, lamps with glass chimneys. She cleaned each piece carefully, methodically, restoring order to chaos. By the time Rosa called her for supper, the parlor gleamed. The windows were clean, the floor swept and mopped, the furniture arranged to catch the afternoon light. It looked lived in rather than abandoned, warm rather than desolate. Ay, Mira, Rosa breathed from the doorway. You work miracles, Miss Caldwell. Mr. Blackwood, he will be pleased. Lydia doubted Rowan Blackwood paid much attention to parlors, but she appreciated the praise. They ate together in the kitchen, Rosa, Miguel, and Lydia, while the ranch hands had their meal in the bunkhouse. Miguel was quieter than his wife, but warm in his own way, asking Lydia about her journey west, about Boston, about her family. She told them the basics, her father's death, the loss of their home, the advertisement that brought her to Colorado. She didn't mention the shame of answering that advertisement, the desperation that had driven her. They didn't ask. Perhaps they understood that some stories were too raw to tell yet. After supper, Lydia climbed the stairs to her room, exhausted but satisfied. Her first full day, and she'd proven herself competent. She'd shown she could work, could be useful, could earn her place here. Tomorrow she'd tackle the dining room, and the day after that the bedrooms. One room at a time, one task at a time, building a life from fragments. She fell asleep before full dark, dreamless and deep. The days developed a rhythm. Wake before dawn, help Rosa with breakfast, then turn to her own work while the men went out to the land. She cleaned room by room, washing windows and scrubbing floors, beating rugs and polishing furniture. The house responded to her attention, shedding its air of abandonment, becoming warm and welcoming. Rowan was gone most days, out on the range with his men. When he was home, he was quiet, courteous, keeping to his study or his room. They saw each other at meals, the lunches she prepared, the occasional dinner. Their conversations were brief, focused on household matters. Did they need more firewood? Was the roof sound before winter? Should she order new curtains for the parlor? It was a strange sort of relationship, intimate in its domesticity but distant in its formality. Lydia cooked his meals, washed his clothes, moved through spaces he occupied, yet she knew almost nothing about him. He was a cipher, this man who'd rescued her, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. He's always been private, Rosa said one afternoon when Lydia had been there 2 weeks. They were in the kitchen, preparing Sunday dinner, Lydia's first time cooking for Rowan entirely on her own. Even before, he kept his thoughts close. But he's a good man, Miss Caldwell. Never forget that. Before what? Lydia asked, seizing the opening. Everyone keeps mentioning before, but no one will tell me what happened. Rosa's hand stilled in the bread dough. She was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with something. Finally, she sighed. His wife died, she said softly. 3 years ago. She was 8 months pregnant. There were complications. The baby came early, and she bled. By the time Miguel could ride for the doctor, it was too late. She and the baby both. Mr. Blackwood, he found them in their bedroom, and there was nothing. Her voice broke. He built this house for her, for their family. And then she was gone. Lydia's hands had frozen on the potatoes she'd been peeling. The pieces clicked into place. The empty bedrooms, the unused dining room, the house built for a family that never came. Rowan Blackwood wasn't just a widower. He was a man who'd lost everything in one terrible night. That's why the house was so neglected, she said quietly. He couldn't bear to care for it. See, for 2 years he barely came inside except to sleep, worked himself nearly to death out on the land. We worried, Miguel and I, we worried he would not survive his grief. But slowly, he came back. Started maintaining the house again, hired the ranch hands, built the operation back up. He's healing, I think. But the sadness, it's still there. Always there. Lydia thought of Rowan's careful courtesy, his emotional reserve, the way he'd offered her work without asking for anything in return. A man who knew what it was to lose everything, who recognized that same loss in her. Does he ever talk about her? Never. There are no photographs, no mementos. He put everything away and locked the door on that part of his life. Maybe that's how he survives. Or maybe, Lydia said softly, that's how he stays trapped. Rosa looked at her sharply. Be careful, Miss Caldwell. Mr. Blackwood's grief is his own. Don't think you can fix it. I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm just trying to understand the man I work for. But that wasn't entirely true. And Lydia knew it. She was trying to understand why Rowan Blackwood had helped her, why he'd seen her dignity when everyone else saw only scandal. And part of her, a small, frightening part, wanted to help him the way he'd helped her, wanted to bring warmth back to this house built for love and hollowed by loss. Sunday dinner was a quiet affair. Lydia had made roast chicken with potatoes and carrots, followed by apple pie from fruit Rosa had preserved. Rowan ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting the meal in his economical way. This is good, he said. Better than I expected for your first time cooking here. I'm glad it meets your standards, Lydia said, allowing herself a small smile. More than meets them. He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. The house looks different, feels different, more like a home should feel. That's my job, isn't it, to keep house? It's more than that, though. He met her eyes across the table, and for a moment his guard dropped. She saw loneliness there, bone deep and aching. The house has been dead a long time. You're bringing it back to life. Houses can't die, Lydia said gently. Only the people in them. His expression shuddered immediately, the moment of vulnerability slamming closed. Maybe so. Thank you for dinner, Miss Caldwell. It was excellent. He left the table, disappearing into his study. Lydia cleared the dishes, replaying the conversation in her mind. She'd pushed too hard, had seen something he didn't want seen and acknowledged it too directly. She'd have to be more careful. Rosa was right. Rowan's grief was his own, and she had no right to intrude on it. But as she washed the dishes in the darkening kitchen, she couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, the loneliness, the way he'd said dead as if he were talking about more than just the house. October deepened into November. The air turned sharp, mornings crisp with frost. The ranch hands brought the cattle down from the high country, and the days filled with the noise and chaos of branding and sorting. Lydia watched from the house sometimes, marveling at the sheer scale of the work, the coordination required to manage so many animals across so much land. Rowan was in his element out there, commanding but never cruel, pushing his men hard but never beyond their limits. She saw why the ranch hands respected him, why Miguel followed his lead without question. He was a natural leader, someone who inspired loyalty through example rather than orders. She saw him differently now, knowing about his wife. Every quiet moment, every emotional retreat, every carefully maintained distance made sense. He'd loved someone deeply, had lost them catastrophically, and had decided, consciously or not, that the safest path was to love nothing and no one ever again. It made her heart ache in ways she didn't want to examine too closely. Her life on the ranch had developed its own shape. She worked 6 days a week, her Sundays free as promised. On those days, she walked the property, exploring the land she now inhabited. The creek that ran through the eastern section, the grove of cottonwoods turning gold, the rocky outcrop that offered views across the entire valley. It was beautiful country, stark and unforgiving, but beautiful. Sometimes she saw Rowan on her walks, checking fence lines on his Sunday rounds, always working. They'd nod to each other, exchange brief pleasantries, then continue on their separate paths. Two lonely people orbiting the same space, never quite connecting. She'd been at the ranch 5 weeks when the first real test came. The day started normally enough, breakfast, cleaning, the usual routines. But by afternoon, dark clouds had piled up against the mountains, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Miguel rode in early, gathering the hands. "Storm coming," he told Rosa. "Big one. Mr. Blackwood wants everyone close to home." By sunset, the storm hit. Wind howled around the house, driving rain that sounded like thrown gravel against the windows. The temperature plummeted. Lydia moved through the house, checking windows, stoking fires, making sure everything was secure against the onslaught. Rowan came in soaked and freezing, having made a final check on the barn and livestock. Lydia had hot coffee and dry clothes ready without being asked, had laid a fire in the parlor, had prepared a hot meal. She saw his surprise, quickly masked, as he found everything anticipated and ready. "Thank you, Miss Caldwell," he said. "You're thinking ahead. That's good." The storm raged all night. Lydia lay in her bed, listening to the wind scream, feeling the house shudder against the assault. She thought about how different this was from Boston, where storms meant rain and inconvenience but rarely real danger. Here, weather could kill, could trap you, freeze you, bury you. The West didn't forgive mistakes. Morning revealed the damage, trees down, fences damaged, a section of the barn roof torn off. The men worked for 3 days straight making repairs, and Lydia worked just as hard keeping everyone fed, keeping the house warm, keeping life functioning while the men dealt with the crisis. She saw Rowan's exhaustion building, saw him pushing past reasonable limits. On the third night, she brought dinner to him in the study where he was reviewing damage reports and calculating costs. "You need to eat," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "I will. Later. Now, Mr. Blackwood, you're no good to anyone if you collapse." He looked up, annoyance flickering across his face, then fading as he saw her expression. Not presumptuous interference, but genuine concern. He sighed and pulled the tray closer. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and there was the ghost of humor in his voice. Lydia turned to leave, then paused. "The ranch will survive this. It's well built, well managed. You've done good work here." "Have I?" He sounded genuinely doubtful. "Yes. Anyone can see that. The house, the land, the way the men follow you, it all speaks to someone who cares deeply about what he's building." Building. He said the word as if tasting it. Sometimes I'm not sure if I'm building or just maintaining, keeping everything running without actually living in it. "Maybe," Lydia said carefully, "that's what grief does. Keeps us maintaining survival when what we need is to live again." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Understanding, recognition, a shared knowledge of loss. Then Rowan looked away, down at his dinner. "Thank you, Miss Caldwell, for the food and the honesty." She left him there, but as she climbed the stairs to her room, she felt something shifting. Some wall between them developing cracks, letting light through. It was dangerous, this growing understanding. She was his employee, temporary at that. She had no business getting emotionally entangled with a man whose heart was buried with his wife. But she couldn't seem to help it. November gave way to December, and with it came the kind of cold that turned breath to fog and made the earth ring like iron underfoot. Lydia had been at the Blackwood Ranch for 2 months now, and the place had transformed under her care. The house gleamed with attention. Curtains she'd mended hung straight in clean windows, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee had replaced the stale air of abandonment. She'd made it a home again, though she tried not to think too hard about what that meant. Her 3-month trial was nearly up. Soon she'd have to decide whether to stay or go, and Rowan would have to decide whether to keep her. They hadn't discussed it yet, though the unspoken question hung between them like frost in the air. The distance between them had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. They talked more now, not just about household matters, but about books, about the land, about the small observations that made up daily life. Rowan had begun taking his coffee in the kitchen some mornings before heading out, sitting across from her while dawn broke outside the windows. They didn't say much during those quiet moments, but the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. Rosa noticed, of course. "He smiles more now," she said one afternoon while they were preparing preserves. "Small smiles, yes, but they are there. Before you came, I could go weeks without seeing him smile at all." "Maybe he's just pleased the house is clean," Lydia said, trying to keep her tone light. "Ay, Nina, you think I'm blind? The way he looks at you when you're not watching, the way he finds reasons to come back to the house during the day. This is not about clean floors." Lydia's hands stilled on the jar she was filling. "Rosa, don't. He's my employer. That's all this is." "Is it?" Rosa's dark eyes were knowing. "And what about the way you look at him? The way you make sure his favorite foods appear on the table? The way you worry when he's out in bad weather?" "That's just doing my job properly. Mija, I've known many housekeepers. None of them looked at their employers the way you look at Mr. Blackwood. And none of them made those employers come alive again the way you've done for him." Before Lydia could respond, Miguel burst through the kitchen door, his face tight with urgency. "Rosa, Miss Caldwell, we've got trouble. Strangers spotted on the North Range, and Charlie found 3 head of cattle missing. Mr. Blackwood thinks we've got rustlers." The word sent ice through Lydia's veins. She'd heard about cattle thieves in town, organized gangs that targeted isolated ranches, stealing livestock, and sometimes worse. Violence wasn't uncommon when thieves got cornered. "Where's Mr. Blackwood now?" Rosa demanded. "Riding out with the boys to track them. He wants you both to stay close to the house, keep the doors locked. Says if anything happens, ring the dinner bell and don't stop until we come running." "Dios mío," Rosa whispered. "Miguel, you be careful out there." "Always am." He kissed her quickly and was gone, leaving the 2 women staring at each other in the suddenly too quiet kitchen. The afternoon crawled past with agonizing slowness. Lydia tried to work but found herself constantly at the windows, scanning the horizon for movement. Rosa paced the kitchen, muttering prayers in Spanish. They heard nothing, no gunshots, no sounds of pursuit, just the vast silence of the Colorado winter pressing in around them. Dusk came early, painting the snow-dusted land in shades of gray and purple. Still no sign of the men. Rosa lit lamps with shaking hands while Lydia checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The house felt different now. Not a refuge, but a potential target, isolated and vulnerable. "They should be back by now," Rosa said for the 10th time. "It's been hours. What if—" A gunshot cracked through the twilight, distant but unmistakable. Then another. Then a rapid series that made both women freeze. "The bell," Lydia said. "Should we—" "No, Mr. Blackwood said only if we're in danger. Those shots, they're too far away. Coming from the north pasture, maybe 2 miles. They waited, hearts pounding, as the silence returned. Minutes stretched like hours. Then, finally, the sound of horses approaching fast. Lydia ran to the window and saw 4 riders coming hard toward the house. Rowan in the lead, the ranch hands behind him. Even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. One of the horses carried double, and the second rider was slumped against the first. "Someone's hurt," she said sharply. "Rosa, get clean cloths and hot water. I'll need the medical kit." They flew into action, years of frontier practicality overriding panic. By the time the men reached the house, Lydia had the kitchen table cleared and supplies ready. Rowan and Charlie half-carried Ben inside, the young cowboy's face pale and his shirt soaked with blood. "Took a bullet in the shoulder," Rowan said, his voice tight. "We got the bleeding slowed, but he needs proper tending." "Put him on the table," Lydia ordered. Then to Ben, "Can you hear me? Stay with us?" "Yes, ma'am," Ben gasped. "Hurts like hell, begging your pardon." "You're entitled to curse right now." She was already cutting away his shirt, exposing the wound. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, painful and bloody, but not immediately life-threatening if they could prevent infection. "This is going to hurt worse before it gets better." She worked quickly, drawing on every bit of knowledge she'd learned helping her father through his illness, every practical skill frontier women needed. Clean the wound, pack it with clean cloth, bind it tight to stop the bleeding. Rosa handed her supplies without being asked, and together they worked with the efficiency of long practice. Ben gritted his teeth through the worst of it, only one strangled cry escaping when Lydia poured whiskey directly into the wound to clean it. Rowan stood close, one hand on Ben's good shoulder, steady and reassuring. "You did good, Ben," he said. "Real good. Stood your ground when those bastards opened fire." "Did we get them, boss?" "Two ran off. One won't be stealing cattle anymore. Charlie winged another one. He'll have a story to tell if he makes it back to wherever they hole up." Rowan's voice was grim. "But they know where we are now. They might come back." "Then we'll be ready," Miguel said from the doorway. He'd brought the rifles in from the barn, was checking ammunition with practiced hands. "Tom, Charlie, you take first watch. 2-hour shifts through the night." Lydia finished bandaging Ben's shoulder and stepped back, wiping blood from her hands. She felt strangely calm, her mind clear and focused despite the danger. "He needs rest and water. Rosa, can we make up a bed in the parlor so we don't have to move him far?" "See, I'll get blankets." They settled Ben on the sofa with pillows and quilts, his color already better now that the immediate crisis had passed. Rosa brought soup while Lydia checked his bandages one more time. The young cowboy looked up at her with gratitude and something like awe. "Thank you, ma'am. You've got steady hands for this kind of work." "My father was ill for a long time. I learned by necessity." "Well, I'm grateful for it." He managed a weak smile. "Guess it's a good thing Mr. Blackwood hired you after all." "Guess it is," Lydia agreed softly. She found Rowan on the front porch, rifle in hand, staring out into the darkness. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and their breath formed white clouds in the lamplight spilling from the windows. He didn't turn when she stepped out, but she felt him register her presence. "You should be inside where it's warm," he said. "So should you." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Ben's resting. Rosa's with him. The wound is clean. He should heal fine if we watch for infection." "You did good work in there. Better than most doctors I've seen." "Desperation makes us capable of surprising things." She paused. "What happened out there?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight. "Found them butchering 3 of our steers in a ravine north of here. 5 men, professional operation. When they saw us coming, they opened fire. Ben went down in the first volley, but he got back up and kept shooting. Drove them off, but not before—" He stopped, drew a breath. "One of them won't be rustling anymore. I put a bullet through him." The weight in his voice told Lydia this wasn't the first time he'd killed, but that didn't make it easier. Taking a life, even in defense of your own, left marks on the soul. "You protected your land and your people," she said quietly. "That's not murder, that's survival." "I know. Doesn't make it sit easier." He finally looked at her, and in the lamplight his eyes were dark and troubled. "This is the reality out here, Miss Caldwell. Violence, danger, the constant threat of losing everything you've built. It's not romantic, it's not noble. It's just hard and sometimes bloody." "I know that. You think I came west expecting romance?" She shook her head. "I came here desperate and alone, was rejected and humiliated, and found work with a stranger who could have been anyone. I've known from the start that this life is hard, but hard doesn't mean it's not worth living." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful walls he maintained. "When I saw Ben go down, my first thought was getting him back here to you. Not just because you could tend the wound, but because I knew you wouldn't fall apart. You'd do what needed doing, same as you've done every day since you arrived. What are you saying? I'm saying I was wrong about why I hired you. His voice had gone rough. I told myself it was practical, just filling a need. But the truth is, I saw you walk out of Pruitt's shop with your head high when you had every right to crumble, and I thought— He stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. I thought, here's someone who understands what it means to keep going when everything's been taken from you. Someone who knows how to survive loss. And I needed someone who understood. Lydia finished softly. Yes. The word came out barely above a whisper. God help me. Yes. The air between them felt charged, dangerous. They were standing too close, alone in the darkness, with violence and fear stripping away pretense. Lydia knew she should step back, should maintain the professional distance that kept them both safe, but she couldn't move. Rowan, she said, using his given name for the first time, what are we doing here? I don't know. His eyes held hers, raw and honest. I told myself I was done feeling anything, that the safest way was to just exist, just work and breathe and not let anything matter too much. But then you came, and you brought this house back to life, and somewhere along the way, a rifle shot split the night, close enough to make them both drop instinctively. Another shot, then Charlie's voice yelling from the barn. Riders coming in fast, 3, maybe 4. The rustlers had come back. Rowan was moving before the echo faded, pushing Lydia toward the door. Inside now, get Rosa and Ben to the cellar. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. I'm not hiding while you— Yes, you are. His voice was steel. I can't fight and worry about you at the same time. Please, Lydia, do this for me. The use of her first name, the naked plea in his eyes, she couldn't refuse. She ran inside, found Rosa already helping Ben to his feet, the 3 of them heading for the cellar stairs as more shots erupted outside. The small underground space was cold and dark, stocked with preserves and root vegetables, never meant to be a shelter but serving as one now. They huddled in the darkness, listening to the battle overhead. Rifle fire, men shouting, the thunder of hooves. Lydia's hands clenched into fists, her whole body rigid with the effort of staying put when every instinct screamed to be upstairs, to see what was happening, to know if Rowan was— No. She wouldn't think it, couldn't. The shooting seemed to go on forever, but probably lasted only minutes. Then silence, awful and complete. Lydia counted heartbeats, trying to stay calm, trying not to imagine the worst. Footsteps on the floor above, heavy boots crossing to the cellar door. Rosa's hand found Lydia's in the dark, squeezing hard. Miss Caldwell? Rosa, it's over. You can come up. Miguel's voice, rough but alive. They climbed the stairs on shaking legs, emerging into a kitchen that looked like a battlefield. Broken glass from a shattered window, bullet holes in the walls, the acrid smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Where's Rowan? Lydia demanded. On the porch. He's all right, but you should see him. She pushed past Miguel, her heart in her throat. Found Rowan sitting on the porch steps, his left arm bleeding through a makeshift bandage, his rifle across his knees. Tom and Charlie stood nearby, both unharmed but shaken. In the yard beyond, 3 horses stood riderless. We got 2 of them, Charlie said quietly. The other ran. Don't think they'll be back. Lydia dropped to her knees beside Rowan, reaching for his injured arm. Let me see. It's nothing, just a graze. Let me see, she repeated, firmer this time. He let her unwrap the bloodied cloth, revealing a deep cut along his bicep, where a bullet had carved a channel through flesh. Not life-threatening, but painful and still bleeding. Without a word, she tore a strip from her petticoat and began binding it properly, her hands steady despite the terror still coursing through her veins. You're getting good at battlefield medicine, Rowan said, a ghost of humor in his voice. I'd rather not have the practice. She pulled the bandage tight, perhaps harder than necessary. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. This time. She looked up, meeting his eyes, and didn't care that Miguel and the others were watching. This time you weren't. But what about next time? What about Lydia? He caught her wrist gently, stopping her frantic movements. I'm all right. We're all right. That's what matters. But she was shaking now, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. All the fear she'd been holding back while she worked, While she stayed calm and did what needed doing, it crashed over her in a wave. She'd come so close to losing him, this man who'd saved her, who'd seen her worth when no one else had, who'd somehow become essential to her in ways she hadn't fully understood until tonight. "Come inside," she said, her voice unsteady. "All of you. I'll make coffee and we'll tend any other injuries." They gathered in the kitchen, 5 people who'd survived a battle, who'd defended their home against thieves who'd have taken everything and maybe killed them all. The reality of it settled over them like a weight. Charlie had a cut on his cheek from flying glass. Tom's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold his coffee cup. Miguel was grimly checking ammunition counts. Rosa was crying quietly, relief and terror releasing in equal measure. And Rowan sat at the head of the table, his wounded arm bound, his face carved from stone, looking at each of his people with an intensity that made Lydia's chest ache. "You all did good," he said finally. "Better than good. You stood your ground, protected what's ours. I won't forget that." "They got away with 3 steers," Charlie said, "before we found them. 3 steers I can replace. None of you can be replaced." Rowan's eyes moved to Ben, who'd insisted on climbing up from the cellar despite his injury. "Ben, you saved Tom's life when you shot that rustler coming around the barn. You were wounded and you still fought." "Just doing my job, boss." "It was more than that." His gaze swept the table again. "All of you, this is more than a job. This place, this ranch, we built it together, and tonight we defended it together. That matters." In the heavy silence that followed, Lydia stood and began gathering the coffee cups. Her hands were still trembling, but she needed to move, needed to do something useful. Rosa rose to help her, and together they started putting the kitchen to rights, while the men discussed night watches and fence repairs, and whether to report the incident to the sheriff in town. It was past midnight when everyone finally dispersed, the ranch hands to the bunkhouse, Rosa and Miguel to their small cabin behind the barn, Ben to his makeshift bed in the parlor. Lydia checked on him one final time, adjusting his blankets, placing fresh water within reach. "Miss Caldwell?" His voice was drowsy with exhaustion and pain. "I'm glad you're here. Glad Mr. Blackwood found you." "So am I," she said softly. "Get some rest now." She climbed the stairs slowly, her body feeling the day's weight. At the top, she found Rowan's door open, lamplight spilling into the hallway. He sat on the edge of his bed, trying one-handed to remove his boots and clearly struggling. "Let me help," Lydia said from the doorway. He looked up, started to refuse, then nodded. She knelt and worked the boots off, setting them aside. His socks were worn, she noticed, with a hole starting in one heel. She'd need to add mending to tomorrow's tasks. "Thank you," he said. She stood, meaning to leave, but found herself unable to move. They stared at each other in the lamplight, the events of the day hanging between them. The violence, the fear, the confession on the porch that had been interrupted by gunfire. "Rowan," she started. "Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't say anything you'll regret in the morning. It's been a hard day. Emotions are running high. Stop protecting me from my own feelings." She moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "Stop protecting yourself by pretending you don't have any." "Lydia, you don't understand. I can't do this again. Can't let myself care and risk losing." "You already care," she interrupted. "You cared from the moment you offered me work instead of charity. You've been caring more every day, whether you admit it or not. I see it in the way you make sure there's firewood by my door on cold mornings, in the way you ask Rosa if I'm eating enough, in the way you looked at me tonight when you thought I might be in danger." He stood abruptly, turning away from her. "My wife died in this house, in a room down this hall. She was carrying our child, and I couldn't save either of them. I held her while she bled out, and there was nothing I could do. That kind of loss, you don't come back from it whole. Part of me died with her." "I know," Lydia said softly, moving to stand behind him. "Rosa told me, and I'm sorry, Rowan. I'm so deeply sorry for what you lost. But you're still here. You're still alive. And tonight proved that you still care about protecting people, about building something, about you." He turned to face her, and the anguish in his eyes made her breath catch. "God help me. I care about you. Started caring before I had any right to, before I even understood what was happening. And it terrifies me because I don't know if I can survive losing someone else. He stopped, the unfinished sentence hanging between them. Someone else he loved. The word he couldn't say echoed in the silence. Lydia felt tears burning behind her eyes, felt her heart breaking and soaring simultaneously. This complicated, wounded man had just confessed something he'd probably never intended to admit, and she understood completely what it cost him. "You're not going to lose me," she said. "I'm right here." "You don't know that." Tonight proved it. Violence can come out of nowhere. Illness, accident, any number of things could. Yes, she cut him off. Any number of things could happen. To me, to you, to anyone. That's life, Rowan. That's the risk of being alive, but you can't stop living just because you're afraid of dying. You can't stop caring just because caring might hurt. "I don't know how to do this," he said, and his voice broke. "Don't know how to let myself feel again without being consumed by fear that it'll all get ripped away." Lydia reached up, cupping his face in her hands, feeling the rough stubble, the tension in his jaw. "Then we'll figure it out together. One day at a time. One moment at a time." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch like a man starving for contact. "Your 3 months are almost up. I haven't asked yet because I was afraid of what you'd say, afraid you'd leave, afraid you'd stay for the wrong reasons. Ask me now," she said. His eyes opened, meeting hers. "Will you stay? Not as just a housekeeper, not as, I don't know what this is yet, don't know what I can offer you beyond honesty and time. But stay. Please. Let me try to be the man I used to be before I lost everything. Let me try with you." The answer rose from somewhere deep in her chest, certain and clear. "Yes, I'll stay." He kissed her then, desperate and gentle, his good arm pulling her close while his injured one hung careful at his side. The kiss tasted of coffee and fear and relief, of two broken people finding unexpected shelter in each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I can't promise this will be easy," he whispered. "Nothing worth having ever is." She smiled against his mouth. "But I'm not afraid of hard work, Rowan Blackwood. You should know that by now." They stood there under the lamplight for a long moment, neither willing to break the fragile connection they'd finally acknowledged. Rowan's thumb traced her cheekbone with a tenderness that made Lydia's heart ache, and she could see him struggling between desire and the deeply ingrained caution that had kept him safe for 3 years. "You should rest," he said finally, though his hand remained on her face. "It's been a hell of a day." "So should you. That arm needs tending in the morning." "Yes, ma'am." The corner of his mouth lifted, almost a smile. "I'm glad you're staying, Lydia. More glad than I know how to say." She kissed him once more, brief and sweet, then forced herself to step away before she did something reckless, like refuse to leave at all. "Good night, Rowan." "Good night." She made her way to her own room, closing the door behind her and leaning against it as her knees finally gave out. Everything had changed tonight. The violence, the fear, the confession that had been building between them for weeks finally spoken aloud. She'd come to this house as an employee, desperate and alone, and somewhere along the way it had become home. He had become home. Sleep was impossible. She lay in bed watching moonlight paint patterns on the ceiling, replaying every word, every touch, every look that had passed between them. The way he'd said her name, rough with emotion. The way he'd kissed her like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. The way he'd asked her to stay not out of convenience but out of need. Somewhere in the house she heard footsteps, Rowan, probably, equally unable to sleep. She understood. When you'd spent years building walls to keep pain out, tearing them down wasn't easy even when you wanted to, especially when you wanted to. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of winter morning where everything looked sharp-edged and unforgiving. Lydia rose and dressed, finding the house already stirring. Rosa was in the kitchen making coffee, her eyes red from crying but her hands steady. "Buenos dias, mija," she said softly. "You look like you didn't sleep much." "Neither did you." "No. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Miguel out there with bullets flying." Rosa poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one toward Lydia. "But we're all alive. That's what matters." "Ben's shoulder. I should check it." "Already did. The boy's tough. Wound looks clean. No fever. Rosa studied Lydia over her cup, a knowing look in her dark eyes. Something happened last night, after we all went to bed. It wasn't a question. Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks. We talked. Ay, see, you talked. And I'm staying, not just as a housekeeper. The words felt strange on her tongue, too new and fragile to be real yet. We're trying to figure out what this is between us. Rosa's face split into a brilliant smile. Finally! Gracias a Dios. That man has been half in love with you since the day he brought you home, but too stubborn and scared to admit it. It's complicated, Rosa. His wife is dead. Rosa's voice was gentle but firm. And he loved her. Yes, truly loved her. But she would not want him to spend the rest of his life alone, punishing himself for surviving when she didn't. You're giving him permission to live again, mija. That's a gift. Before Lydia could respond, the kitchen door opened and Rowan walked in, his injured arm cradled against his chest. He'd clearly slept as little as she had, but something in his face had softened. When his eyes found Lydia, warmth kindled there, tentative but real. Morning, he said. Morning. Sit down. Let me look at that arm. He obeyed without argument, which told Lydia it probably hurt more than he was letting on. She unwrapped the bandage carefully, relieved to see the wound was clean if angry-looking. Rosa brought hot water and clean cloths without being asked, and together they cleaned and rebound the injury properly. You need to keep this clean and dry, Lydia said. No heavy lifting for at least a week. Can't promise that. There's work to be done. Then you'll delegate. Miguel and the boys can handle whatever needs handling. She met his eyes, holding firm. I didn't patch you up last night just to watch you tear it open again through stubbornness. She's right, boss, Miguel said from the doorway. We can manage. You need to heal. Rowan looked like he wanted to argue, but subsided with a sigh. Fine, 1 week, but I'm still riding out to check the property lines, make sure those rustlers didn't do more damage we haven't found yet. I'm coming with you, Lydia said. Like hell you are. You just agreed you can't do heavy work. If something needs fixing, you'll need an extra pair of hands. Besides, I should know the full extent of the property if I'm staying. She watched realization dawn in his eyes, that she was staying, that this was real, that they'd crossed some invisible line in the darkness and there was no going back. His expression softened. All right, he said quietly. But your riding lady, she's the gentlest horse we've got, and you stay close to me. They set out mid-morning after Lydia had checked on Ben one more time and changed into her most practical dress. Rosa lent her a heavy coat and gloves, clucking like a worried hen as she bundled Lydia up against the cold. Miguel saddled 2 horses, a placid mare for Lydia and Rowan's big gelding, and gave her a few quick instructions on handling the reins. You've ridden before? Rowan asked as he helped her mount. A few times, years ago. I'm not confident, but I can manage. We'll take it slow. They rode out across land that looked different in daylight, vast and rolling, marked by fence lines and scattered cattle, the mountains rising like sentinels in the distance. Rowan pointed out landmarks, explained how the ranch was laid out, showed her the places where trouble had happened and where it might come again. This northern section is the most vulnerable, he said as they paused on a ridge overlooking a wide valley. Too far from the house to hear trouble, too many ravines and hiding places. We'll need to run more patrols up here, maybe put a line cabin in for the hands to use during calving season. That makes sense. Lydia studied the landscape, trying to see it through his eyes. Not just beautiful, but functional, every feature a factor in the endless calculation of survival and profit. When did you buy this land? 8 years ago. It was raw territory then, nothing but grass and possibility. Built the house first. He stopped, and she heard the catch in his voice. Knew he was thinking about who he'd built it for, who he'd planned to fill those empty rooms with. Built it to last. Whatever else happened, I wanted something solid, something that would outlive me. You succeeded. It's a beautiful house, Rowan. A beautiful ranch. It is now. You've done more in 2 months than I managed in 3 years. He looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression. I gave up on it, you know, after she died. Let it all go to hell because I couldn't bear to care for things she was supposed to see, supposed to enjoy. Easier to let it rot than to keep making it beautiful, when she'd never see it. And now? Now I want it beautiful again. His voice dropped. Want to prove to myself I can still build something, still create instead of just maintain. Want you to have a home worthy of you. The words settled into Lydia's chest, warm and weighty. This was more than just a confession of feeling. It was a promise, a commitment to try, to build a future when he'd been convinced his future had died 3 years ago. Rowan, I need to understand something. What are we doing here? What is this between us? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out over his land. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. I don't know yet. All I know is that when those rustlers opened fire last night, my first thought was keeping you safe. My second thought was that I'd be damned if I survived my wife just to die before telling you the truth. That somewhere in the last 2 months, you became essential to me, not just as help around the house, but as you, as Lydia. I feel the same, she said softly. I didn't mean to. Tried not to, actually. You were my employer and I needed the job too badly to complicate things. But you were so kind underneath all that gruff distance, so gentle with your animals and fair with your men, and the way you looked at me sometimes. She paused, gathering courage. Like I mattered, like I was worth something more than just the work I could do. No one had looked at me like that in so long. You matter, Rowan said fiercely. Don't ever doubt that. They rode in silence for a while, checking fence lines and examining the places where the cattle had been butchered. The rustlers had made a mess of it, taking only the choice cuts and leaving the rest to rot. Rowan's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage, but he said nothing, just made mental notes and kept moving. It was past noon when they stopped to rest the horses by a creek. The water ran clear and cold, ice forming at the edges. Rowan dismounted stiffly, favoring his injured arm, and helped Lydia down. She'd been riding for hours and her legs felt like jelly, but she tried not to show it. You did good, he said, catching her elbow when she stumbled. Better than most first-timers on a long ride. I'm stubborn when I need to be. Notice that about you. He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened. Stubborn and brave and too damn competent for your own good. Is that a complaint? It's admiration. He pulled her closer, his good arm circling her waist. I admire the hell out of you, Lydia Caldwell. The way you've faced everything thrown at you without breaking, the way you've made a home out of a house that was barely more than a shell, you're remarkable. I'm just surviving, same as you. No, you're living. There's a difference. His thumb traced her jaw, the same gesture from last night, and Lydia felt her breath catch. I forgot how to live. You're reminding me. He kissed her there by the frozen creek, with the horses grazing nearby and the winter sun cold on their faces. It was different from last night's kiss, less desperate, more deliberate, a claiming and a promise. When they finally broke apart, Lydia was trembling, but not from the cold. We should get back, Rowan said, though he made no move to release her. It'll be dark soon, and I don't want to worry Rosa. In a minute, Lydia rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Just give me a minute more. They stood there wrapped in each other while the day faded around them, two people who'd survived their own private disasters, finding unexpected shelter in each other's arms. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't even particularly comfortable, given the cold and the hard ground and the very real dangers that still surrounded them. But it was real, and for both of them, that was enough. The ride back was slower, companionable, both of them lost in their own thoughts. As the house came into view, solid and welcoming with smoke rising from the chimney, Lydia felt something shift in her chest. This was home now. Not temporarily, not conditionally, but truly home. The place where she belonged, with the man beside her who'd seen her worth when the rest of the world saw only a rejected bride. Rosa met them at the door, her face anxious until she saw they were both unharmed. Supper's ready. Ben's fever is still down and the sheriff came by. The sheriff? Rowan's voice sharpened. What did he want? Says 2 men stumbled into town this morning, shot up and talking about how you murdered their friends. He wanted to hear your side of the story. And? Miguel told him everything. How they were stealing your cattle, how they opened fire first, how Ben got shot defending the property. The sheriff said it was clearly self-defense, especially with Ben wounded as proof. He's not pressing any charges, but he warned that the gang might try for revenge. Of course they might. Rowan rubbed his face with his good hand, suddenly looking exhausted. Did he at least take their names? Any way to track down the rest of them? He's sending word to neighboring counties, but Rowan, Rosa's voice dropped. He said we should be prepared. These men, they don't forgive being crossed, and they know where we are now. The warm glow from their ride dissipated, replaced by cold reality. They'd won one battle, but the war wasn't over. Might never be over, out here where law was sparse and revenge was easier than justice. We'll double the watches, Rowan said, and I'll ride into town tomorrow, talk to some of the other ranchers, see if we can organize a joint patrol, strengthen numbers. I'm coming with you, Lydia said. Lydia, don't argue. You need someone to keep that arm clean, and besides, she met his eyes steadily. I'm part of this ranch now, part of this life. That means I share the dangers as well as the safety. She saw the struggle in his face, the instinct to protect warring with the respect he had for her autonomy. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you stay close. They ate supper together, the whole household gathered in the kitchen, ranch hands and family all mixed together. It felt like what Lydia imagined a real home should feel like, everyone contributing, everyone mattering. Ben was up and moving despite his injury, insisting he could manage light work. Charlie and Tom traded stories about the fight, their voices growing bolder now that the immediate danger had passed. Miguel and Rosa exchanged glances across the table, the kind of silent communication that came from years of partnership. And Rowan sat at the head of the table, his injured arm bound against his chest, watching over his people with a protective intensity that made Lydia's heart ache. This was what he'd built here, not just a profitable ranch, but a community, a family of choice held together by loyalty and shared purpose. After supper, when the others had dispersed, Lydia found Rowan in his study going over accounts. The lamp cast shadows across his face, making him look older and more tired than his years. You should rest, she said from the doorway. Can't. Need to figure out what the loss of those 3 steers means for the winter budget. He set down his pen, rubbing his eyes. We were already cutting things close. This doesn't help. How bad is it? Bad enough. Between the storm damage last month and now this, I might have to let one of the hands go. Can't afford to keep everyone on through winter at current wages. Lydia moved into the room, perching on the edge of his desk. You won't let anyone go. You're too loyal for that. Loyalty doesn't pay bills. No, but there are other ways to manage. Cut back on other expenses, delay some of the repairs until spring, ask the hands if they'd accept reduced wages temporarily. She reached out, took his good hand in both of hers. You'll figure it out, Rowan. You always do. How do you know? Because you're still here, still fighting. A man who gives up doesn't build a place like this, doesn't inspire loyalty like you do. You're stronger than you think. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. Sometimes I feel like I'm barely holding on, like one more disaster will break me completely. Then we'll hold on together. She squeezed his hand. That's what this is, isn't it? Not just you and me figuring out our feelings, but being partners, supporting each other when things get hard. Is that what you want? A partnership? Yes. The answer came without hesitation. Not as your housekeeper, not as your whatever I was supposed to be, as your equal partner in building this life. Something shifted in his eyes, a decision made. He stood, pulled her up to face him, and from his pocket withdrew a small velvet box. Lydia's breath stopped. I've been carrying this for a week, he said quietly. Ever since I realized your 3 months was coming up and I couldn't imagine you leaving. Wasn't sure when to ask, wasn't even sure you'd say yes. But after last night, after today, Lydia, I know we've only known each other 2 months. I know this is fast and probably crazy. But I also know I don't want to waste any more time pretending I don't care, pretending I'm content being alone. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small diamond, not ostentatious but beautiful in its understated elegance. This was my mother's ring. Only thing of value she left me when she died. I want you to have it. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice shook. Lydia Caldwell, would you marry me? Not out of desperation or convenience, but because I love you. Because you make me want to live again instead of just survive. Because I can't imagine my future without you in it. Tears blurred Lydia's vision. This was nothing like Gerald Pruitt's cold transaction, nothing like the desperate arrangement she'd traveled west to fulfill. This was a man offering her not just his name, but his heart, asking her to build a life with him as equals, as partners. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Then he kissed her, and there was nothing tentative about it now. This was certainty, commitment, the kind of kiss that marked a beginning rather than an end. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rowan pressed his forehead to hers. I can't promise it'll be easy, can't promise I won't still struggle with the ghosts of what I lost, but I promise I'll try, Lydia. Every day I'll try to be the man you deserve. You already are, she said, and I promise the same, to try, to stay, to build this life with you no matter what comes. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, the ring on Lydia's finger catching the light and throwing small rainbows across the walls. Outside, the night was cold and dangerous, full of threats they couldn't control. But inside, in this moment, they were safe. They were together. They were home. The next morning dawned clear and cold, and Rowan was insistent about riding into town despite his injury. Lydia dressed in her best dress, the dark blue wool she'd worn on the train, now cleaned and mended, and they made the journey together, the ring on her finger feeling both strange and right. Ridgewood looked different now. What had been the site of her humiliation 2 months ago was now just a collection of buildings, ordinary and unremarkable. They stopped first at the general store where Rowan ordered supplies, then at the land office to file some paperwork. People stared, of course. The rejected mail-order bride now engaged to Rowan Blackwood was gossip worth savoring. Let them stare. Lydia held her head high, her hand secure in Rowan's, no longer ashamed of her story. She'd been broken and desperate once, but she'd survived. She'd rebuilt. And now she was choosing love on her own terms, with a man who saw her worth. Their last stop was the church. Reverend Matthews was a kind-faced man in his 50s who listened carefully as Rowan explained they wanted to marry quickly, before Christmas if possible. No big ceremony, just the legal words that would bind them together. I could do it this Sunday, the Reverend said, after regular services. Give me time to prepare the paperwork and make sure everything's proper. This Sunday? Lydia repeated. That was only 4 days away. Too fast? Rowan asked quietly, searching her face. She thought about all the time she'd already lost to grief and desperation, all the months she'd spent just surviving instead of living. Thought about how much had changed in 2 short months, how Rowan had gone from stranger to savior to something infinitely more precious. No, she said firmly. This Sunday is perfect. They made the arrangements, simple vows, no guests beyond the ranch household, a brief ceremony that would make legal what their hearts had already decided. As they left the church, Lydia caught sight of Gerald Pruitt across the street, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not jealousy exactly, but something close to regret. Want to say something to him? Rowan asked, following her gaze. No. She turned away, dismissing Gerald Pruitt as thoroughly as he'd dismissed her. He's not worth our time. They rode home in comfortable silence, the winter sun bright on the snow-covered land. Lydia felt the weight of the ring on her finger, the solid presence of Rowan beside her, and for the first time since her father died, she felt something like joy. Rosa cried when they told her, gathering Lydia into a fierce embrace. I knew it! I told Miguel just this morning. I said they're going to. Oh, mija, I'm so happy for you both. Miguel shook Rowan's hand with quiet dignity. She's good for you, boss. Makes you remember who you used to be. The ranch hands celebrated with whoops and backslapping, thrilled to have something good to focus on after the violence of the previous days. Even Ben, still recovering from his wound, managed a smile and a toast with watered-down whiskey. That night, as Lydia prepared for bed, she stood at her window looking out over the dark land. Somewhere out there, danger still lurked, rustlers who might return, winter storms, the 1,000 uncertainties of frontier life. But inside this house, she'd found something she'd thought lost forever. A place to belong, work that mattered, people who cared, and a man who loved her not despite her brokenness but because of it. because he understood what it meant to shatter and rebuild, to carry loss and still reach for hope. Sunday would make it official, but in her heart, Lydia was already home. The 4 days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and nervous anticipation. Rosa threw herself into cooking with fierce joy, determined to provide a proper wedding feast even with limited resources. Miguel and the ranch hands worked on repairs with renewed energy, as if making the place perfect for the occasion could somehow ward off the darkness that had threatened them. And Lydia found herself caught between disbelief and bone-deep certainty that this was right, that marrying Rowan Blackwood after knowing him barely 2 months was exactly what she was meant to do. She'd written a letter to her father's minister in Boston, the man who'd provided her reference for Gerald Pruitt's advertisement, telling him the whole story, how she'd been rejected, found work, fallen in love with a widowed rancher who treated her like an equal. She didn't know if he'd approve, didn't particularly care, but somehow it felt important to tell someone from her old life that she'd survived, that she'd found not just safety, but happiness in the most unexpected place. On Saturday evening, the night before the wedding, Rosa insisted on helping Lydia prepare her dress. It was the same dark blue wool she'd worn on the train, but Rosa had spent hours working on it, adding lace at the collar that she'd saved from her own wedding dress, taking in the waist so it fit properly, pressing it until every wrinkle disappeared. "You'll be beautiful," Rosa said, her eyes damp. "Mr. Blackwood, he won't be able to look away." "It's just us, Rosa. No fancy church service, no guests beyond you and Miguel and the boys." "Mija, a wedding is a wedding. You think it matters how many people watch? What matters is 2 people choosing each other in front of God and everyone who loves them." She adjusted the lace one more time. "And we do love you. You've become family these past months." The words brought tears to Lydia's eyes. Family. She'd lost her father, had no siblings, no relatives who'd bothered to stay in touch once the money ran out. She'd been so utterly alone that answering a mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like her only option. And now here she was, surrounded by people who'd chosen to care about her not out of obligation, but genuine affection. "I love you too," she said softly. "All of you. This place. It saved me, Rosa. Rowan saved me." "No, mija. You saved yourself. Mr. Blackwood, he just gave you the chance. Everything else, everything you've built here, that's all you." That night, Lydia lay awake listening to the house settle around her. Tomorrow she'd become Lydia Blackwood, would move from the room she'd occupied for 2 months to the one down the hall that Rowan had been carefully, methodically preparing. He'd cleaned out the last traces of his first wife, had painted the walls and bought new curtains, had made it a space for their future rather than a shrine to his past. The gesture had touched her more than any romantic declaration could have. She heard his footsteps in the hallway, pacing. He couldn't sleep either, apparently. Part of her wanted to go to him, to spend these last hours before the wedding in his arms. But Rosa had been firm about tradition. No seeing each other until the ceremony, no matter how modern they thought they were. "Some things," she'd said, "are worth doing right." So Lydia stayed in her room and listened to Rowan pace, and felt the connection between them humming through the walls like electricity through wire. Tomorrow they'd stand before the Reverend and speak vows that would bind them legally, spiritually, permanently. The thought should have terrified her. She barely knew this man, hadn't known him at all 3 months ago. But terror had been replaced by certainty. She knew what mattered, that he was kind and fair, that he kept his promises, that he looked at her like she was precious. Everything else they'd learned together. Dawn came too slowly and too quickly at once. Lydia rose and dressed with Rosa's help, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons. The woman in the mirror looked different from the desperate stranger who'd stepped off the train in September. That woman had been hollow-eyed and frightened, dressed in grief and shame. This woman wore hope like a crown, her gray eyes bright, her chin lifted. She'd been broken and had rebuilt herself into something stronger. "Perfecta," Rosa breathed. "Come, we should go. The men are already at the church." The ride into town was quiet, just Lydia and Rosa in the wagon while Miguel drove. The morning was cold and clear, frost sparkling on every surface like diamonds scattered across the earth. Ridgewood's church looked humble but welcoming, its crooked steeple reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Inside, the small sanctuary was warmer, heated by a pot-bellied stove. Reverend Matthews waited at the altar, his prayer book open. And there, standing with his back to the door, was Rowan. He'd traded his work clothes for a suit, black wool, probably the same one he'd worn to his first wedding, but it fit him well. His dark hair was neatly combed, his injured arm out of its sling, though Lydia knew it still pained him. He turned as she entered, and the look on his face stopped her breath. Wonder and nervousness and something so tender it made her chest ache. This hard man, this rancher who'd survived loss that would have destroyed most people, was looking at her like she was a miracle. Miguel escorted her down the short aisle, performing the role her father should have filled. Charlie, Tom, and Ben sat in the front pew, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best. They grinned at her as she passed, their young faces alight with genuine happiness. And then she was standing beside Rowan, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the scar on his jaw she'd never asked about, the tremor in his hands as he reached for hers. Reverend Matthews began speaking, the old familiar words that had joined countless couples before them. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Lydia heard the words as if from a distance, too focused on Rowan's face, on the way he was looking at her like he still couldn't quite believe this was happening. She squeezed his hands, trying to communicate what she couldn't say aloud, that she was here, that she was real, that she was choosing him as completely as he was choosing her. The Reverend reached the vows. "Rowan Blackwood, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" Rowan's voice was steady, clear, certain. "I do." "And do you, Lydia Caldwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" She thought of everything that had brought her to this moment: her father's death, the loss of her home, the desperate journey west, Gerald Pruitt's rejection, the humiliation and fear and desperate scrambling for survival, and then Rowan, stepping in not with pity but with respect, offering her dignity when the world had tried to strip it away. "I do," she said, her voice strong. The Reverend smiled. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Rowan, you may kiss your bride." Rowan cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite his calloused palms. "Hello, Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured, and then he kissed her. Not the passionate kisses they'd shared in private, but something sweeter, a promise, a beginning, a claiming that was also a gift. The small congregation erupted in cheers. Rosa was crying openly, Miguel beaming, the ranch hands whooping like they'd just won a prize. Lydia broke the kiss, laughing, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. They signed the marriage certificate with the Reverend as witness, making it official and legal. Lydia Blackwood. The name felt strange and wonderful on the page, in her new signature. She was no longer Lydia Caldwell, orphaned and alone. She was Lydia Blackwood, wife and partner, belonging to someone who belonged to her in equal measure. The celebration continued at the ranch. Rosa had somehow produced a wedding cake, small but beautifully decorated, and Miguel had sacrificed one of their precious chickens for a proper feast. They ate in the kitchen, all of them crowded around the table, the room warm with laughter and affection. Charlie told embarrassing stories about Rowan from before Lydia arrived, about the time he'd tried to cook for himself and nearly burned down the kitchen, about his terrible singing voice that scared the cattle. "That's enough," Rowan said, but he was smiling, more relaxed than Lydia had ever seen him. His hand found hers under the table, lacing their fingers together, and she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered land in shades of gold and purple, their guests tactfully withdrew. Miguel and Rosa to their cabin, the ranch hands to the bunkhouse, leaving Rowan and Lydia alone in the house that was now truly theirs. Rowan took her hand, leading her upstairs to the room he'd prepared. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, warming the space. The new curtains, a soft cream color, glowed in the firelight. The bed was made with fresh linens, and on the nightstand stood a vase with winter greenery, the only flowers available in December. "I know it's not much," he said, sounding uncertain for the first time all day. "Not fancy like you probably had in Boston." "It's perfect." Lydia turned to face him, reaching up to loosen his tie. "Everything about today has been perfect. Everything about us is perfect. We barely know each other," he said, echoing her own earlier thoughts. 3 months ago, you didn't know I existed. 3 months ago, I was drowning. You threw me a rope, Rowan. More than that, you reminded me I knew how to swim." She finished with his tie, moved to the buttons of his vest. "I know the things that matter. I know you're honest and fair. I know you protect the people you care about. I know you've survived loss that would have destroyed most people and somehow kept your capacity for kindness intact. What else do I need to know? That I'm going to fail you sometimes. That I'll wake up in the middle of the night remembering her, remembering everything I lost, and I won't be able to help it." His voice cracked. "That I'm terrified of loving you this much because loss has taught me that everything good eventually gets taken away." Lydia stilled, her hands on his chest. "Look at me." She waited until his eyes met hers. "I'm not her, Rowan. I'm not a replacement or a second chance at what you lost. I'm something new. And yes, you'll remember her. I hope you do. She was your wife, you loved her, and that love doesn't disappear just because you love me now. But I'm not threatened by your grief. I have my own grief, my own losses. We'll carry them together." "How did I get this lucky?" he whispered. "How did Gerald Pruitt's cruelty lead to you? Maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe it was just life, steering us toward each other through the worst possible path, because the easy road wouldn't have brought us here." She kissed him softly. "And I'm grateful for every terrible thing that happened, because they all led me to you." They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they'd given to learning each other's hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the firelight, talking in whispers about everything and nothing. Their childhoods, their dreams, the small details that made up a life. Rowan told her about his mother, who died when he was young, about his father, who'd been a hard man but fair, about how he'd come west seeking his fortune and found it in this land, in cattle and grass and endless sky. Lydia told him about her father's law practice, about the slow decline after her mother died, how he'd tried so hard to provide for her, but the world had been merciless. About the shame of poverty, of answering that advertisement, of the hope she'd carried onto the train, and the devastation when Gerald Pruitt had looked at her and found her wanting. "He was a fool," Rowan said fiercely. "The biggest fool in Colorado." "Maybe, but if he'd kept his word, I'd be his wife right now, trapped in a marriage with a man who saw me as a transaction. Instead, I'm here, with you, and I've never been happier." "Neither have I." He pulled her closer, his breath warm against her hair. "I thought happiness was behind me. Thought the best I could hope for was to get through each day without falling apart. And then you showed up, all fierce dignity and quiet competence, and suddenly I wanted more than just survival. Wanted to actually live again." They talked until the fire burned low and sleep finally claimed them, wrapped in each other's arms in a room that smelled of new beginnings and old promises kept. The first weeks of their marriage settled into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Lydia still kept house, but now she did it as a partner rather than an employee. She and Rowan made decisions together about supplies to order, repairs to prioritize, how to manage the ranch through the lean winter months. He taught her to ride properly, to read the weather, to understand the subtle signs that told when cattle were sick or when predators were near. She taught him to appreciate small comforts, to take time for meals instead of bolting food between tasks, to let himself rest when his body demanded it. The rustlers didn't return, though they all remained vigilant. Rowan organized a patrol system with neighboring ranches, men riding the boundaries in rotating shifts to watch for trouble. It was exhausting work in winter weather, but it gave everyone a sense of control, of proactive defense rather than passive waiting. Christmas came quietly. They couldn't afford extravagance, but Rosa made her special tamales, and Lydia baked bread and pies until the house smelled like celebration. The ranch hands received small bonuses from Rowan despite the tight budget, and Miguel and Rosa got new winter coats they desperately needed. For each other, Rowan and Lydia exchanged gifts that were more meaningful than expensive. He gave her a journal bound in leather for writing. She gave him a new watch to replace the broken one he'd been carrying since his father died. "Thank you," he said, turning the watch over in his hands. "This is... I didn't expect... You deserve something that works," she said simply. "Something that marks our time together, not the time that came before." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and later when they were alone he showed her just how grateful he was in ways that made her blush to remember. Winter deepened, bringing storms that isolated them for days at a time. During those snowed-in periods, Lydia discovered a peace she'd never known existed. The world narrowed to the house, the people in it, the simple routines of survival. She and Rosa worked side by side in the kitchen, preserving food and mending clothes. She read aloud to Rowan in the evenings, books borrowed from the town library, Shakespeare and Dickens and American poets who wrote about landscapes that looked like the one outside their windows. "I never had time for this before," Rowan admitted one night as she finished a chapter of Whitman. "Always too busy working, too busy building. Never stopped to appreciate that building includes these moments too. Beauty and rest and words that matter. You're making time now, that's what counts. Because you make me want to. Make me remember there's more to life than just getting through it." In February, Ben's shoulder healed completely, and he returned to full work, celebrating by challenging Tom to see who could mend fence faster. Charlie started courting a girl in town, riding in every Sunday after church to see her, his face going red whenever anyone teased him about it. Miguel taught Lydia to speak more Spanish, amused by her Boston accent mangling his beautiful language. And Rosa began teaching her the secrets of frontier cooking, how to stretch ingredients, how to make tough meat tender, how to create abundance from scarcity. Lydia found she had a gift for it. Not just cooking, but the whole complex dance of running a frontier household. She kept detailed records of supplies and expenses, finding ways to save money without sacrificing quality. She started a vegetable garden, planning what they'd plant in spring. She learned to shoot, Rowan teaching her patiently until she could hit targets with reasonable accuracy. "You're a natural," he said, watching her reload with practiced efficiency. "Most people flinch when they fire. You just accept the recoil and adjust." "I've learned to accept a lot of things and adjust," she said wryly. "That you have." He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "My remarkable wife. Is there anything you can't do?" "I can't rope cattle worth a damn, as we discovered last week." He laughed, the sound rich and unguarded. He laughed more now, she'd noticed. Smiled more. The haunted look that had shadowed his eyes when she first met him appeared less frequently, replaced by something lighter. He was healing, slowly but surely, learning to carry his grief without letting it crush him. Spring came late that year, winter holding on with bitter determination. But eventually the snow began to melt, revealing brown grass that would green up in the warmth. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds returned, filling the air with song. And with spring came new challenges and new opportunities. The cattle needed moving to higher pastures. Fences needed repair after winter damage. There were calves being born, each one representing profit or loss depending on whether it survived. Rowan was out from dawn to long past dusk, working himself to exhaustion, and Lydia worried about him pushing too hard. "I'm fine," he insisted when she confronted him one evening. "This is just how spring works on a ranch. All hands needed." "All hands including mine?" she asked. He stopped, looked at her carefully. "What are you suggesting?" "That I come out with you. Not to do the heavy work, but to help where I can. I'm a decent rider now, and I can learn the rest." "It's hard work, Lydia. Long hours in the saddle, camping rough, dealing with stubborn cattle in dangerous terrain." "I know. That's why I want to help. We're partners, remember? That means sharing all of it, not just the comfortable parts." So she joined the spring roundup, and it was every bit as hard as he'd warned. Her body ached from hours in the saddle, her hands blistered from rope work, her face burned from sun and wind. But she also experienced a fierce joy she'd never known, riding across open land with the mountains watching, working alongside men who respected her competence, feeling her body grow stronger and more capable with each day. Rowan watched her with something like awe. "You're the damnedest woman I've ever known," he said one night as they camped under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "City-raised, educated, could have had a comfortable life somewhere civilized. Instead, you're out here eating beans from a tin plate,
and sleeping on the ground. "This is comfortable," she said, snuggled against him in their shared bedroll. "Maybe not physically, but in every way that matters. I belong here, Rowan, with you, with this land, with this life we're building." "You belong here," he agreed softly, "more than I ever dared hope someone could."
By summer, the ranch was thriving despite the losses of winter. The cattle were healthy, the grass was good, and several neighboring ranchers had approached Rowan about buying breeding stock. Money was still tight, but not desperately so. They could afford to keep all the ranch hands on, could make the repairs the property needed, could even start planning for expansion. "I've been thinking," Rowan said one evening as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the sky, "about building that line cabin we discussed, and maybe another barn for winter hay storage, things that will make the ranch more efficient, more profitable." "That sounds good. What else?" He was quiet for a moment, his hand finding hers. "I've been thinking about children, about whether we might—" He stopped, struggling with words. "I know it's complicated. The baby I lost with Sarah, there's fear there, but also hope, if you're willing." Lydia's heart clenched. They'd been careful, had avoided discussing this particular future because the grief was still so close to the surface for him. But now here he was, offering her this gift, trusting her with his deepest wounds. "I would love that," she said softly. "When we're ready, when you're ready." "I think I might be. Not to replace what I lost, I know that's impossible, but to build something new, with you." She kissed him as the sun sank below the mountains, and later that night they made love with new intention, new possibility. Whether anything came of it immediately didn't matter. What mattered was that Rowan had opened himself to the future again, had chosen hope over fear. Autumn came again, marking a full year since Lydia had stepped off that train in Ridgewood. On the anniversary of that day, Rowan surprised her with a trip into town, not for supplies or business, but simply to walk down the main street together, to have lunch at the small restaurant, to show the world that they were happy and thriving. They passed Gerald Pruitt's shop, and through the window Lydia saw him serving a customer. He looked older, more tired, and when he glanced up and met her eyes, she saw only regret there. No satisfaction, no vindication, just regret for the choice he'd made, for the life he'd rejected. She felt nothing. Not anger, not triumph, not even pity. He was simply irrelevant, a man who'd briefly intersected her story but had no part in her present or future. "You all right?" Rowan asked, noticing where she was looking. "More than all right. I was just thinking how grateful I am that he said no. How everything terrible that happened led me exactly where I needed to be." "To me," Rowan said. "To you. To home." They continued down the street, and people nodded to them, the rancher and his wife, respected members of the community. No longer the scandalous mail-order bride and the grieving widower, but simply Rowan and Lydia Blackwood, partners building a life together. That winter was easier than the previous one. They'd learned from experience, had planned better, had stored more supplies. When storms came, they were prepared. When cattle got sick, they had medicine ready. When loneliness threatened during the long, dark months, they had each other. In March, Lydia woke feeling strangely unsettled. Her stomach was uneasy. Her body felt different in ways she couldn't quite name. Rosa took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "Mija, I think you should see the doctor in town." "I'm not sick." "No, you're not sick." Rosa's smile widened. "But you should still see the doctor." Understanding dawned slowly, then all at once. Lydia pressed a hand to her stomach, scarcely daring to hope. "Do you really think—" "I've had 3 children. I know the signs. Go to town, get it confirmed, then tell that husband of yours he's going to be a father." The doctor confirmed it. 6 weeks along, due in late September. Lydia rode home in a daze, her hand pressed protectively over her stomach where a new life was growing. Rowan's child. Their child. The future they'd hoped for made real. She found him in the barn, repairing tack. He looked up as she entered, and something in her face must have given it away because he froze. "Lydia? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She moved closer, took his hands and placed them on her still flat stomach. "Everything's right. We're having a baby, Rowan.
You're going to be a father." The color drained from his face. For a moment she feared she'd miscalculated, that the joy would be overshadowed by remembered grief. But then tears spilled down his cheeks, and he pulled her close, holding her like she was made of glass. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear it. Terrified, he admitted. "But yes, God, yes, I'm happy. Happy and scared and grateful, and—" He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Thank you. Thank you for giving me this second chance at everything I thought I'd lost." "We're giving it to each other," she corrected. "This baby, this life. It's ours together." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Lydia continued working as long as she could, though Rowan and Rosa both fussed over her constantly. She was healthy and strong, her body taking to pregnancy with the same competence it had brought to everything else. By summer, her belly was round and obvious, and the entire ranch was preparing for the baby's arrival. Rowan built a cradle with his own hands, spending evenings in his workshop carving it from oak. Rosa sewed blankets and tiny clothes. Miguel crafted a rocking horse for when the baby was older. Even the ranch hands contributed, Tom building a changing table and Ben constructing a toy chest. "This baby's going to be so loved," Lydia said one evening, watching Rowan test the cradle's rockers. "So protected." "Damned right," Rowan said. "After everything we've been through to get here, this child is going to know they're wanted, every single day." As her due date approached, Rowan arranged for a midwife to stay at the ranch. Mrs. Chen was an experienced woman who'd delivered half the babies in the county, and her calm competence eased Rowan's visible anxiety. "Your wife is healthy and strong," she told him. "I see no cause for concern, but I'll be here, just in case." Labor began on a cool September evening, almost exactly 1 year after Lydia had accepted Rowan's proposal. It was long and hard, and there were moments when Lydia understood viscerally why Rowan was terrified, why loss was a shadow he couldn't completely shake. But she was strong, and Mrs. Chen was skilled, and Rosa held her hand through the worst of it, murmuring prayers and encouragement. Just after dawn, their daughter was born, perfect and healthy, with a strong cry that echoed through the house. Mrs. Chen placed the baby in Lydia's arms, and the world narrowed to that tiny face, those seeking eyes, the miracle of life they'd created. "She's beautiful," Lydia whispered. Rowan stood frozen in the doorway where he'd been banished during the delivery, his face stark with fear and hope. Are you both?" "We're fine," Lydia said, smiling through tears. "Come meet your daughter." He approached slowly, as if the baby might disappear if he moved too fast. When he finally took her in his arms, his hands shook. "She's so small," he said in wonder. "So perfect." "She has your eyes," Lydia said. "Or she will, when they change." "And your stubborn chin," he countered, laughing through tears. They named her Sarah Grace, honoring the past while embracing the future. Sarah for the wife Rowan had loved and lost, Grace for the unexpected gift that had brought them together. When people asked about the name, they explained simply, Sarah was loved and Grace was found, and together they made something new. The baby thrived, growing strong and healthy. The ranch thrived too, expanding and becoming more profitable with each season. Rowan hired another hand, built the line cabin and second barn he'd planned, started breeding horses in addition to cattle. Lydia became known throughout the county for her hospitality and her sharp business sense, managing the ranch books and negotiating prices with buyers. 2 years later, they had a son, Daniel, named for Lydia's father. Then 3 years after that, another daughter they named Rosa, after the woman who'd been a mother to Lydia when she had none. The house filled with laughter and noise and the beautiful chaos of children. Ridgewood grew too, from a rough frontier town to a proper community. They built a school, and Lydia served on the board, ensuring that all children had access to education regardless of their family's wealth. She remembered too well what poverty had meant for her own education, how her father had struggled to afford books and tutors. She was determined that no child in their community would face those same barriers. The years passed in a blur of work and joy and the ordinary struggles that made up a life. There were hard seasons when drought threatened the cattle, winters when illness swept through the household, moments of fear when riders approached unannounced or storms turned violent.
But they faced everything together, Rowan and Lydia, partners in every sense of the word, supporting each other through crises and celebrating victories as a team. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Rowan surprised her with a gift. Not jewelry or clothing, but a sheaf of papers, the deed to the ranch, now in both their names equally. "This has always been ours," he said. "But I wanted it legal, official. Everything I have, everything I am, it's shared with you. I want the world to know it." Lydia looked at the papers, at her name in legal script. Lydia Blackwood, joint owner. It meant more than romance, more than any flowery declaration of love. It meant he saw her as his equal, his partner, someone who'd earned this place through years of work and dedication. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for this, but for everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For believing in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. For loving me exactly as I am." "That's easy," he said, pulling her close. "You're the easiest person in the world to love." They stood on their porch, the same porch where he'd confessed his feelings during the Rustler attack, where they'd shared their first real kiss. Below them, their children played in the yard, Sarah teaching Daniel to rope fence posts, baby Rosa toddling after them with determined steps. Beyond the yard, the land rolled away toward mountains that had witnessed every moment of their story. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lydia asked. "When I stepped off the train expecting to marry Gerald Pruitt?" "Sometimes. Usually when I'm counting my blessings and need to remember how close I came to missing all this. I think about it too, about how devastated I was, how certain my life was over." She leaned into him, feeling his warmth, his solidity. "I thought I was losing everything, but I was actually finding it." "Finding what?" "Home, purpose, love that wasn't transactional but real, a life worth living instead of just surviving." She turned to face him, cupping his scarred, weathered face in her hands. "You didn't save me, Rowan. You gave me the chance to save myself, to prove that I was more than my circumstances, stronger than my fears. And in doing that, you saved yourself too." "We saved each other," he said softly. "That's what love is, isn't it? Not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing to face the world together, making each other braver and stronger than they'd be alone." "Yes," Lydia agreed. "That's exactly what love is." Years continued to unfold, bringing their share of joy and sorrow. They buried Miguel after a heart attack took him suddenly one spring morning, the entire community gathering to honor a man who'd been friend and family to so many. Rosa moved into the main house afterward, helping raise the children and managing the household with the same fierce competence she'd always shown. Charlie married his sweetheart and started a ranch of his own, building on lessons learned working for Rowan. Ben became foreman when Miguel died, proving himself a capable leader. Tom moved to Denver seeking city life, but wrote letters describing how much he missed the mountains. Lydia's father's minister wrote back eventually, his letter arriving 2 years after she'd sent her own. He apologized for the delay. He'd been ill, had fallen behind on correspondence. He said he was glad she'd found happiness, that her father would have been proud of the woman she'd become. The letter arrived on a day when Lydia particularly needed it, when the grief of losing her father felt fresh despite the years. She cried reading it, and Rowan held her while she mourned the parent who'd never met his grandchildren, never seen the life she'd built. "He knew you were strong," Rowan said. "That's why he didn't worry. He knew whatever happened, you'd find your way. I wish he'd lived to see it, to know I didn't just survive but thrived." "He knows," Rowan said with certainty. "Wherever he is, he knows." Sarah grew into a fierce, competent young woman who could ride and rope better than most men, and had no patience for anyone who suggested ranching wasn't women's work. Daniel was quieter, more scholarly, eventually leaving to study law in the East, following his grandfather's profession, but determined to practice it better, to serve the people who couldn't afford fancy lawyers. Young Rosa was the most like her namesake, warm and nurturing, declaring at age 8 that she wanted to be a teacher so she could help children learn. And through it all, Rowan and Lydia remained the center, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They still made time for evening conversations on the porch, still took rides across their land just to remember its beauty, still found moments to steal kisses in the barn or hold each other close on cold winter nights. On the 20th anniversary of that day in September, when Lydia had stepped off the train, the whole community gathered at the Blackwood Ranch for a celebration. Not just to mark Rowan and Lydia's marriage, but to celebrate everything they'd built: the thriving ranch, the school they'd helped establish, the example they'd set of partnership and perseverance. Gerald Pruitt came too, though he stayed at the edges of the crowd. He'd never married, had sold his shop, and now worked for another merchant, looking diminished and tired. When he approached Lydia, his face was lined with regret. "Mrs. Blackwood," he said formally, I've wanted to apologize for 20 years. What I did, breaking my word, leaving you stranded, it was unconscionable. You deserve better." Lydia studied him, this man who'd once had the power to destroy her with a few cold words. She felt nothing but mild pity. "Yes," she agreed, "I did deserve better, and I found it. So in a way, Mr. Pruitt, I should thank you. Your rejection was the best thing that ever happened to me." He flinched, but nodded. "I can see that. You've built something remarkable here. I'm glad. I'm glad it worked out for you." "It worked out for me because I worked for it," Lydia corrected gently. "Because I refused to let your cruelty define me. Because I chose to see possibility instead of disaster. That's not luck, Mr. Pruitt. That's character." He left shortly after, and Lydia never saw him again. She heard years later that he'd died alone. His business failed, his life a cautionary tale about the cost of cruelty and broken promises. She felt sad for him, but not guilty. Everyone made their choices, and everyone lived with the consequences. As the sun set on their celebration, Lydia found Rowan standing apart from the crowd, watching their guests with a contemplative expression. "What are you thinking?" she asked, slipping her hand into his. "That I almost missed all this. If Sarah hadn't died, if I'd never been broken enough to build these particular walls, I would never have seen you, never recognized what you were, what we could be together." He turned to her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I loved her, Lydia, loved her deeply, and her loss nearly killed me. But somehow that loss led me to you, and I can't regret the path that brought us here, even though it was carved through grief." "I understand," Lydia said, because she did. "I loved my father, and losing him devastated me. But if he hadn't died, I would never have come west, would never have answered that advertisement, never been rejected, never found you. The worst things that happened to us created the space for the best things to grow." "That's terrifying," Rowan said. "And beautiful," Lydia added. "Terrifying and beautiful, like everything worth having." They stood together as darkness fell and stars emerged, watching their children playing with friends' children, listening to laughter and music from the party, continuing without them. This was their legacy, not just land and cattle and property, but community and love and proof that broken people could rebuild themselves into something stronger than they'd been before breaking. "I love you," Rowan said, the words as familiar as breathing after 20 years, but no less meaningful. "Every day I love you more." "And I love you," Lydia replied. "My stubborn, wonderful, infuriating, perfect husband. Thank you for seeing me that day in Ridgewood. Thank you for offering me work instead of pity. Thank you for loving me before I ever knew I needed it." "I didn't love you before you arrived," he said, smiling at the old phrase she sometimes teased him with. "I loved the strength in you from the moment I saw it. The rest just followed naturally." They returned to their guests hand in hand, partners in every sense, living proof that the worst beginnings could lead to the most beautiful endings. And years later, when their grandchildren asked how they'd met, Lydia would tell them the truth, that she'd come west as an unwanted bride and found instead a partnership, a purpose, and a love that had transformed not just her life, but everyone around her. She'd been meant for this life all along, she'd say. She just hadn't known it until a cold September day when one man's cruelty had led to another man's kindness, and everything had changed. She'd been loved before she ever arrived, not by the man who'd sent for her, but by the one who'd been watching, who'd seen her worth when she'd forgotten it herself, who'd offered her not rescue but the chance to be remarkable. And she had been remarkable. They both had. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and partnership that would echo through generations. This was their story, and it was complete.